Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Poltergeist of Salt Lake City. Gray clouds hovered over us as we pulled up to our new house in Salt Lake City, casting a somber shadow over the property. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning in an old, charming home. But as soon as I laid eyes on the house, a cold sense of dread crept into my chest. The house was large, with peeling paint on the shutters and ivy curling up the cracked bricks like it was trying to swallow the place whole. Large, dusty windows lined the upper floor, but one window, positioned above the front door, felt like it was staring down at us, an unblinking, hollow eye. The trees around the house loomed close, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the house, and the lawn was thick with neglected weeds and dark patches of soil. Emma, my wife, was immediately enchanted. "It has so much character," she said with a grin, her eyes glinting with excitement. "Can't you just imagine the stories it could tell?" I tried to smile back, but something in me wanted to stay quiet. I felt as though we were intruding, stepping uninvited into a place that had been long asleep, and now it was stirring, aware of us, sizing us up. Our son, Henry, was still asleep in his car seat, his small hand wrapped around his favorite stuffed bear. As we started unloading the car, I felt a chill sweep over me, as though the breeze had suddenly turned sharp and icy. But the air was still. I shivered, though I couldn't explain why. Emma noticed and raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong? Cold feet?" "No, it's nothing. Just tired, I guess," I mumbled. I didn't want to ruin her excitement or make her worry over something as silly as a bad feeling. Still, as we carried the first boxes up the creaking porch steps, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. When I turned to look, my gaze drifted to the window above the door. For a split second, I thought I saw something, maybe just a shadow, shift behind the glass. A vague silhouette. I squinted, trying to focus, but it was gone. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Emma brushed past me, gently nudging open the front door with her shoulder. The door creaked, swinging inward slowly, and a faint gust of stale air rushed out to greet us, thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and something else. A faint metallic scent, sharp and unpleasant, lingered just beneath the surface, like rusting iron. The entire house felt still, frozen in time. As we stepped inside, I heard the soft echo of our footsteps in the entryway, bouncing off the high ceiling in empty rooms. The house was silent, but it was a charged silence, thick and heavy, as though it were waiting, watching. "Look at this place," Emma whispered, her voice almost reverent. "It's like it's been frozen in time." I forced myself to nod, even as the cold sensation spread, settling in the pit of my stomach. I had an odd, irrational urge to turn and leave, to take Emma and Henry and run before anything happened. But what could happen? It was just an old house, an empty, quiet house. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. Emma's voice broke my thoughts. "Honey, come on. We need to start unpacking, and Henry needs his bed set up. He'll love it here," she added, glancing back at our sleeping son. With a deep breath, I set down the boxes and looked around, trying to convince myself that this was just another house, that it couldn't possibly hold any threats. But as I glanced around, I couldn't ignore the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. And high above, in the dusty window that loomed over the door, something watched us enter, unseen but very much there. We had barely started unpacking when Henry stirred from his nap, rubbing his sleepy eyes. He looked around, his face crinkling in confusion as he took in the high ceilings and faded wallpaper. "Where are we?" he asked in a small voice, clutching his bear. "This is our new home, buddy," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "What do you think?" He looked around, his eyes wide and uncertain. "It's big," he whispered, as though afraid of disturbing the silence. Emma ruffled his hair. "You're going to love it here, Henry. Just wait until you see your room. We'll have it all set up soon." We led him upstairs to the room we'd chosen for him. It was at the end of the long, dim hallway, with a window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The wallpaper was faded with little pale blue stars scattered across it, remnants of a child's room from another time. Henry seemed unsure, his eyes darting around the empty space, as though expecting something to jump out at him. "Can we leave the door open?" he asked. "Of course, honey," Emma replied, smoothing the blankets on his bed. "But you're safe here. This is your room now, okay?" Henry nodded slowly, still holding tight to his bear. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking toward the door as if keeping watch. Emma and I left him to settle in, hoping he'd soon feel at home. I gave him a reassuring smile and left the door ajar as he'd asked. But later that evening, as I was carrying a box down the hallway, I heard a small, frightened voice behind me. "Daddy?" I turned to find Henry standing in his doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was gripping his bear so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down to his level. "What's wrong?" He pointed shakily toward his room. There was a man standing there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "A man?" I tried to hide the shiver that ran through me. "What did he look like?" Henry glanced back at the doorway, as if expecting to see someone there again. He didn't have a face. He was just there, standing in the door, looking at me. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I glanced into his room, but of course, it was empty. I told myself it was just his imagination. Maybe a shadow had fallen across the doorway, or he'd seen his own reflection in the window. "It's okay, Henry," I said, forcing a smile. "There's no one there. It's just us, remember?" But as I led him back to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he had seen something. And in the darkened hallway, I could have sworn that a shadow moved, just out of sight, lingering by his doorway. That night, as we settled into bed, I couldn't get Henry's words out of my head. The way he described it, a faceless man just standing there, looking at him. It lingered, twisting in my mind, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite shake. Emma turned to me, sensing my unease. "You okay?" "You seem distracted," she asked, her voice soft in the dim light. I hesitated, then sighed. "Henry thinks he saw someone in his doorway," I admitted, trying to sound nonchalant. "He said it looked like a man without a face. I think it spooked him." Emma raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "A faceless man? Sounds like he's got quite the imagination," she said, chuckling. "Kids can come up with the strangest things, can't they?" "Yeah," I said, though I couldn't muster a laugh. "I guess it's all new to him. Maybe the move is just making him a little jumpy." Emma nodded, but then her expression softened with a hint of worry. "He'll get used to it. It's a big change for all of us," she murmured, placing a comforting hand on my arm. "And the house does have that old house vibe. Shadows, creaks, drafts, it could make anyone's imagination run wild." I nodded, more to reassure her than myself. I didn't want to admit how tense I felt every time I walked down the hallway or caught a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye. Even when I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that we weren't alone here, that the house had a presence of its own, quietly observing us. "It's probably just the stress of moving," I said aloud, trying to convince both of us. "A new house, all the unpacking, maybe my mind is just playing tricks on me. I'm probably just picking up on Henry's nervousness." Emma squeezed my hand and nodded, though a shadow of concern lingered in her gaze. "We'll settle in soon enough. Just give it time," she said, her voice soothing. "This house will feel like home before we know it." As I lay beside her in the dark, though, I couldn't shake the lingering echoes of faint sounds, the creak of footsteps that didn't belong to us, soft murmurs from somewhere in the walls, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of an old house, the sounds of a structure getting used to new inhabitants. But deep down, something inside me knew it was more than that. In the quiet of our room, I could feel the house breathing around us, thick with secrets, as though it had been waiting for someone to listen. The house was quiet, cloaked in shadows as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was still, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every creak and murmur of the old wood seemed amplified, filling the silence with small, persistent sounds that made my skin prickle. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the usual noises of an old house settling in the night. But then, just as I began to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps. A slow, deliberate creak of wood from somewhere above us, coming from the attic. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a slow, dragging step, followed by another. Someone, or something, was moving up there, shifting in the shadows above us. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, something that had gotten in through a gap or crack. But these were heavy steps, too solid and too deliberate for any small creature. For a few moments, I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling as though I could somehow see through it, into the attic. The footsteps grew louder, and I felt the pull of curiosity and dread, gnawing at me until I couldn't ignore it. With a quiet breath, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emma. I grabbed the small flashlight we kept in a drawer by the bed, then slowly made my way to the attic stairs, trying to keep my footsteps light. The old stairs creaked under my weight, and I winced, hoping I wasn't about to wake the entire house. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, hand resting on the old doorknob. The silence beyond the door felt thick, heavy with a strange anticipation, as though the air itself was holding its breath. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The attic was dark, except for a thin beam of moonlight slipping through the tiny, dust-covered window. I swept my flashlight across the room, searching for any sign of movement. The light flickered over old, forgotten things, dust-covered boxes, an antique trunk, a few pieces of broken furniture leaning against the walls. But the room was empty. I moved cautiously, taking a few steps inside. The air was cold, damp, and it carried that faint metallic smell I noticed earlier. It was sharper up here, clinging to the walls and lingering in my nostrils. I strained to listen, waiting for any hint of those footsteps. But there was nothing. Only silence. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the flashlight. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, as though I'd been expecting. I didn't know what. Something to be here, watching, waiting. With one last sweep of the flashlight, I backed out of the attic, closing the door quietly behind me. I turned to go back downstairs, trying to shake the unease that clung to me, but just as I reached the top of the stairs, I thought I heard it again, a single, slow creak from the other side of the attic door. I didn't turn back. I descended the stairs quickly, refusing to look behind me, trying to tell myself it was only the old woods settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the house making noise. Something, or someone, had been there, lurking just out of sight, hiding in the darkness of the attic. And as I slipped back into bed beside Emma, I could still hear that faint, rhythmic creak echoing in my mind, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. Returning to bed was supposed to bring relief, a haven of warmth and familiarity to chase away the lingering unease from the attic. But as I slipped under the covers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The darkness in our room felt heavier, as if the shadows had thickened, pressing in closer. I lay there, listening to Emma's soft breathing beside me, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. That the footsteps were just a trick of my mind, the attic merely empty space filled with forgotten relics. But as I stared into the blackness, I realized I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. After a few minutes, I got up again, driven by an urge I couldn't explain. The hallway was colder than before, an unnatural chill settling over it. The dim light cast from a single nightlight down the hall barely illuminated the darkened space, but it was enough to see the hallway mirror glinting at the end of the corridor, a faint gleam in the shadows. But something was wrong. As I drew closer, a shiver ran down my spine. A long, jagged crack had appeared in the mirror, stretching from one corner to the other, splitting the glass in two. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. We would have noticed such a striking flaw. I stepped closer, feeling an odd compulsion to examine the crack. The fractured glass seemed to distort my reflection, turning it into a fractured, twisted version of myself. My face was divided in two, the crack slicing through my image like a scar. Suddenly, a chill swept over me, a sensation so intense that I could almost feel it sinking into my bones. It was as if icy fingers were tracing my skin, lingering at the back of my neck. I wanted to look away, to move, but something held me there, transfixed by my fractured reflection. And then, I felt it, the unmistakable weight of a gaze, as though someone were standing right behind me, watching in silence. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. Only shadows filled the space, stretched long and still. Yet, the sensation remained, that unshakable feeling of a presence lurking just out of sight, hovering in the shadows, its gaze pinned to me like a cold, invisible hand. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes still darting between the empty hall and the mirror. My reflection looked distorted, almost unrecognizable, as if something else were watching me from within the glass itself. The house was silent, but it was a silence filled with something dark, something old, like a memory that had surfaced from the depths. I turned and hurried back to the bedroom, closing the door behind me, trying to block out the strange, unwelcome presence. But as I lay down again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for us in this house, watching and waiting for years. And now that we were here, it was finally awake, with cold, unblinking eyes fixed on us, hidden just beyond the edge of sight. The next morning, after a restless night, I decided to make good on a plan that had crossed my mind ever since we moved in. Something about the house felt unsteady, as though it was brimming with untold stories. I needed answers, if only to put my mind at ease. Down the street was a small coffee shop that doubled as a local gathering spot. I grabbed a coffee and struck up a conversation with the barista, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and curious eyes. When I mentioned her house, her eyebrows raised and she leaned forward. "Are you talking about the old Bannister place?" she asked, a touch of surprise in her voice. Yeah, I think so," I replied, unsure whether to feel encouraged or wary. "We just moved in a few days ago. Beautiful place, but, well, it's got a bit of a strange atmosphere, I guess." Her smile faded a bit, and she looked over her shoulder as if checking for listening ears. "People in this neighborhood know about that house," she said quietly. "It's been empty for years. No one wanted to buy it after what happened to the last owners." That caught my attention. I leaned in, trying to keep my voice steady. "What exactly happened?" She hesitated, eyes darting from side to side as if deciding how much to reveal. "The Bannisters lived there, a family of 4. Nice people, kept to themselves mostly, but the neighborhood kids would sometimes see them in the backyard. Then, one winter, they all just vanished. The police were called in when no one saw them for days, and their relatives couldn't reach them." "What did the police find?" I asked, feeling a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Nothing definitive, at least," she replied, her face grave. "There were signs of a struggle inside the house, and some say there was blood. But they never found the Bannisters. It was like they'd just vanished, right there in the middle of their lives. Rumors spread, of course. Some said it was a break-in gone wrong, others thought it was something more unnatural. But no one could ever explain the strange markings they found on the walls or the cracks in all the mirrors. The mention of mirrors sent a chill through me, and I remembered the fractured reflection I'd seen last night, split by that jagged line. I forced myself to stay calm. "So the house just sat empty?" She nodded. "There were a few attempts to sell it over the years, but no one stayed long. People would move in, and within days, strange things would start happening. Some heard voices, others saw shadows. No one lasted more than a few weeks." She paused, eyeing me with a look of sympathy. "I don't mean to scare you, but people say that house has a way of holding onto its past." I forced a small, uneasy smile, unsure what to make of it. "Thanks for telling me. It's good to know a bit about the place." She offered a slight nod, her eyes dark with concern. "Just be careful," she murmured. "Some places are better left alone." As I walked back to the house, her words echoed in my mind, each one planting seeds of doubt. What had we gotten ourselves into? That afternoon, I decided to take a stroll around the neighborhood, hoping to meet a few of our new neighbors. Part of me just wanted to reassure myself that life here could feel normal, that maybe we could even forget the strange occurrences from the previous night. A couple of houses down, I ran into an elderly woman trimming her rose bushes. She looked up and gave me a polite smile while I introduced myself, but when I mentioned which house we'd moved into, her expression shifted. Her smile faltered, and a shadow passed over her face. "Oh, so you're the new folks in the old Bannister place," she said quietly, setting down her shears. "It's brave of you." "Brave?" I repeated, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel a hint of tension creeping in. She gave me a solemn nod. "People around here, we don't talk about that house much. Most of us know its history, and we've seen what happens to anyone who tries to settle in there." I took a slow breath, sensing that she had more to share, so I waited, hoping she would continue. She glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I suppose you've already noticed it, the way the air feels heavier there, colder. And at night, she trailed off, shuddering. Let's just say, none of us would walk past it after dark. Before I could ask for more details, another neighbor, a tall, wiry man in his 60s, approached, having overheard our conversation. He gave me a curt nod, his face lined with something that looked like both pity and caution. "Ma'am's right," he added, his voice low. "That house has a past. Dark one. The Bannisters were good people. But that place, it's cursed, or haunted, or something. Everyone in town has heard the stories." I swallowed, forcing a thin smile. "I'm not sure I believe in ghosts," I replied, trying to mask my discomfort. The man shook his head. "I'd say most of us don't either, not until we've heard that place at night. The footsteps, the whispers. Seen shadows that don't belong to anyone." He held my gaze, his expression grim. "You'll find out soon enough. Whatever happened to those poor folks, it's like their spirits, or something worse, still linger in those walls. Mark my words." The elderly woman sighed, her expression softening as she looked at me. "Young man, take this as a friendly warning. Keep your family close, and if things start feeling wrong, trust your instincts." I nodded, feeling an odd weight settle over me. Their words were laced with years of collective memory, caution that wasn't easily dismissed. I forced a smile, thanked them for their time, and headed back home. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the words they used: cursed, haunted. These weren't just tales spun from imagination. I could see it in their faces, the raw memory of something experienced firsthand. Back at the house, I looked up at its towering, dark shape, feeling a chill run through me. It was as if the house had heard every word and was daring me to step inside, challenging me to dismiss its ghosts. The strange happenings were starting to pile up, and it wasn't just the creaks in the night or the eerie sensation of being watched. It was our son, Henry. He had always been a quiet child, content with his toys and books, but over the last few days, something about him had changed. At first, it was small things. He'd seem to wander off in the middle of play, staring into corners or the empty hallway, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Emma and I chalked it up to him adjusting to the move, maybe a bit of stress from the change in environment. But then, one afternoon, while I was sitting in the living room going over some unpacked boxes, Henry came up to me with a serious look on his face. He tugged at my sleeve and said something that made the blood freeze in my veins. "I'm playing with my friend," he said, looking up at me with wide eyes. "He's in the room with me. He talks to me sometimes." "Your friend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "What's his name, buddy?" Henry paused, furrowing his brow as if trying to recall something. "He doesn't have a name," he said slowly, his voice taking on a tone I hadn't heard before. "He's just there." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Where is he right now?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my heart was beginning to race. Henry pointed to the corner of the room, a small, shadowed space where the sunlight barely reached. "He's right there. He likes to play with my toys." I turned toward the corner he indicated, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I nodded slowly, trying to act nonchalant. "That's nice, buddy. But don't forget, people can't always see your friend." Henry smiled, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "He's not a person. He's just here. He helps me with my puzzles." I gave him a tight smile, trying to hide the unease gnawing at me. This was not like Henry at all. He had always been an imaginative child, yes, but this was different. There was an edge to his words, an unsettling certainty in his voice that didn't feel like something a child should say. I could hear the faintest trace of something else in his words, as though his friend were more than just a figment of his imagination. Later that evening, when Emma and I were discussing dinner plans, I heard Henry talking again, his voice drifting from his bedroom. "Mom, Dad," he called out excitedly. "Come see. He's playing with me." Emma and I exchanged a worried glance before we both stood up and walked toward his room. As we stepped into the doorway, Henry was sitting on the floor, his toys scattered around him. But there was something off. Henry was talking to the air, pointing at the space next to him as if someone, or something, was sitting beside him. "See? He's here, just like I told you." Henry beamed, his voice filled with pure delight. But the space beside him was empty. The room was still. I felt a tightening in my chest as I exchanged a look with Emma. She looked pale, her lips pressed together in a thin line, trying to maintain composure. We had both heard him talking, but neither of us had seen anyone else in the room with him. "Henry, sweetheart, who are you talking to?" Emma asked gently, sitting beside him on the floor. Henry turned to her with a bright smile. "My friend. He's right here. He's playing with my cars." He paused, and his smile faltered slightly, as though listening to something. "He says he likes you, Mom. He says you're nice." Emma's face went white, and she blinked rapidly as if trying to force the words out of her mind. I stood frozen in the doorway, every muscle in my body tense. A heavy silence filled the room as the air seemed to grow thicker, the chill creeping back. I knelt beside Henry and whispered, "Who is your friend, Henry?" He tilted his head, his eyes wide and innocent. "He doesn't have a name. But he's always here, always watching. He likes when I talk to him." "Henry," I said, trying to stay calm, "tell me, where does your friend go when he's not here?" The boy looked at the empty space again, his gaze distant, as though speaking to someone unseen. "He goes into the walls. He says that's where he sleeps. He can't come out during the day. Only at night." I stood up abruptly, my mind spinning. "You're not to play by yourself anymore, okay, buddy? If you ever see your friend, you come get us, understand?" Henry nodded without question, but as he did, he cast one more lingering glance toward the empty space by the wall. I felt it again, the sensation of being watched, of something unseen and yet unmistakably present. When we left Henry's room, Emma and I didn't speak. The house felt colder, the air heavier, as if something had shifted once again. We had been hoping the stories about the house were just that, stories. But now, I wasn't so sure. Henry had always been sensitive, perceptive in ways that even we couldn't explain, and whatever was happening in that house, he seemed to be its first target. And it wasn't just the house, it was something that lived inside it, something old and restless, something that had never left. The more I tried to push the unsettling feelings aside, the more they clung to me. The house had a way of drawing me in, making me feel like I was unraveling its dark secrets. Something about its walls whispered, like they were begging to be understood. One afternoon, as I worked in the basement, trying to organize the clutter left behind by previous tenants, I noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that seemed a little out of place, an old patch of drywall that didn't match the rest of the room. It was slightly askew, as though it had been hastily patched up years ago. Curious, I grabbed a hammer and carefully knocked at the edge. The wall gave way easily, the sound of crumbling plaster echoing through the basement. Behind it, hidden in the recess, was an old, rusted metal box. The kind you don't expect to find in a home like this. I pulled the box out, my hands trembling slightly as I wiped off the dust. It was a weathered, small thing, almost like a time capsule from the past. It had clearly been there for decades, perhaps longer. My curiosity piqued. I opened the lid, revealing the contents inside. The first thing I noticed was an old camera. It was battered and worn, its leather case scratched and torn, as though it had been tossed around carelessly. Next to it were several stacks of yellowed photographs, the edges curling with age. My heart began to race, and I found myself gripping the camera, drawn to it as though it had some magnetic pull. I hesitated, but then began to sift through the photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Most were of a family, possibly the Bannisters, looking normal enough at first glance, standing in the backyard, posing in front of the house. But the more I looked, the more I saw that didn't make sense. One photograph caught my eye. It was a picture of the family, mom, dad, 2 children, standing in front of the house, smiling. But in the corner, barely noticeable at first, was a dark shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't a person, nor a reflection. It was something off. The shape was distorted, jagged, almost like a figure hovering at the edge of the frame. I turned the photograph over. There was no date, no name, just a faint, smudged writing that read, "We're always here." My pulse quickened, and I flipped through more of the photos. In one, the children stood near the fireplace, but their faces were obscured by strange, dark smudges that resembled shadows, shapes that twisted unnaturally across the surface of the image. Another photo showed a close-up of the parents smiling, but their eyes were blank, hollow, as if something had drained all life from their faces. My fingers shook as I dropped the last photo and reached for the camera. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but as I pulled the film roll from the camera and held it up to the light, I realized there were faint markings on it, almost like ghostly figures embedded in the film itself. A strange coldness began to creep over me. It was as if the very air in the basement had shifted, heavy with the presence of something that had been waiting. I could almost hear the soft whispering of voices in the distance, and I felt an inexplicable urge to leave, to abandon the box and its contents. But I couldn't. Instead, I clutched the camera to my chest, my breath shallow and quick. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to stop, to put everything back, to forget what I uncovered. But I didn't. Something about the photographs, about the faces, felt like they were beckoning me, urging me to learn more. I placed the photographs back into the box, but the image of the shadowy figure haunted me. Whatever had happened to the Bannisters, whatever had caused their disappearance, it was as though it was still clinging to the house, lurking in the spaces where time itself had stopped. I knew then that I was no longer just a bystander in this house. I was part of its history now, entwined with its dark past. And whatever was in those photographs, whatever was in that camera, it was following me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house had always felt cold, but tonight the chill was different, more biting, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing in the darkness. I kept hearing those faint noises again, the scratching sound from the walls, the soft shuffling steps, like something moving just out of sight. I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks, but it was hard to ignore the way the air grew denser, thicker, each time I passed through the long, narrow corridor that led to the stairway. The hall was dimly lit by an overhead light, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. I walked down it, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence, when something caught my eye. The large mirror hanging on the wall just ahead, the one that had always seemed to reflect the dimness of the hallway like a pool of water, began to tremble. At first, I thought it was my imagination, perhaps a draft, but then the sound grew louder, sharper, like glass cracking under pressure. Before I could even step closer, the mirror shattered. It wasn't just a crack this time. A jagged web of fractures spread across the surface in an instant, as though the glass had been split by something invisible, something relentless. I stepped back, my breath quickening, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I stared at the mirror, my mouth went dry. Where the cracks had formed, something else appeared, faces. At first, I thought they were reflections, distorted by the broken glass. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't reflections at all. These were other faces, pale, flickering like shadows, their eyes wide with fear and agony. They pressed against the glass from the inside, their features twisted in silent screams. I staggered backward, my hands fumbling for the wall as I tried to steady myself. My head swam. It wasn't possible, this couldn't be happening. But the faces were still there, moving slightly, as if trying to break through. Some of them were familiar, distorted versions of the family from the photographs. The Bannisters. The air grew colder still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of suffocation, like the walls were closing in. I wanted to look away, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the mirror. The faces seemed to stare directly at me now, their eyes pleading, their mouths opening in silent desperation. One of the figures, the mother, lifted a hand, pressing it against the glass, and for a moment I thought I could hear a voice, faint and distant. It was so soft, so desperate, that I almost couldn't make out the words. But then it became clearer. Leave. Leave this house. It is not safe. I stumbled backward, falling against the doorframe as I gasped for breath. My body trembled uncontrollably, every instinct in me screaming to flee, to run away from this nightmare. But my feet were frozen, glued to the floor as I watched the faces disappear, fading into the cracks, leaving the mirror dark and empty once more. I didn't know how long I stood there, my mind trying to process what I had just witnessed. Was I losing my mind? Had the stress of the move, the strange events, finally gotten to me? Or was something else happening here, something far darker than I could comprehend? I turned away from the mirror, but the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. I could still hear their voices echoing in my mind. The whispers. The warning. I was no longer sure of what was real and what was just a figment of my terrified imagination. But one thing was certain now, whatever haunted this house, whatever had been trapped within these walls for so long, was not going to let me leave easily. It was watching, waiting, and I could feel its presence closing in, like the walls themselves were beginning to breathe in time with my own frantic heartbeats. I wasn't just living in this house anymore. I was part of its curse, and it would not let me go. It started subtly, the first few things out of place almost unnoticeable. A book on the shelf, slightly askew. A chair that had been moved just a few inches from its usual spot. At first, I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness. After all, we were still unpacking, adjusting to the new space. But soon, the small disturbances grew more pronounced, more unsettling. It began with a loud crash one evening. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up the kitchen when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, followed by the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart lurched in my chest, and I rushed to the living room, dreading what I might find. There, in the center of the room, lay the antique vase that had been sitting untouched on the mantelpiece. Now, it was smashed into jagged pieces, its ceramic shards scattered across the floor. But I hadn't heard anyone near it. I hadn't even heard footsteps. The room was still and silent, save for my rapid breathing. I glanced at my wife, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her mouth open in shock. Did you do this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "No," I replied, my words barely more than a whisper. "I didn't touch it. I was in the kitchen." We both stared at the broken vase for a long time, trying to make sense of it. But there was no explanation. Nothing had fallen. No draft. No wind. It just happened. As the days passed, the incidents became more frequent, more difficult to ignore. Small objects began to disappear: an old watch I'd left on the kitchen counter, a set of keys, the half-empty glass of water I'd set down on the table. I'd searched the house, calling out to my wife and son, only to find everything exactly as it had been, except the missing items. And then came the cracks. I noticed them first on the mirrors. The long, thin fissures appeared overnight, seemingly out of nowhere. At first, it was just one small line across the bathroom mirror, but then more followed: another crack in the hallway mirror, another in the large one above the fireplace. Each one was different, some straight, others jagged, but all of them were identical in one disturbing way. They spread. Slowly, steadily, as if the mirrors were being shattered from the inside out. It wasn't just the mirrors. A crack appeared in one of the windows in the living room, running down from the top left corner like a scar. I checked the frame, the glass, everything seemed intact, no reason for the damage. Yet, there it was, growing larger with each passing day, as though the house itself was slowly breaking apart, piece by piece. "John," my wife's voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face drawn tight with worry. She was holding the family photo album, and when I looked closer, I saw the same look of unease on her face that I had felt for days. This wasn't here before. She opened the album, flipping through the pages until she came to the photo of the Bannister family, the one with the strange shadow in the corner. But the page was different now. The photo, once crisp and clear, had changed. The edges were darker, smeared with an oily substance that seemed to bleed from the paper itself. The faces in the photograph had also changed, their features growing more grotesque, their eyes hollow and sunken, as though the very images were decaying before our eyes. I took a step forward, my stomach sinking. What happened to it? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like it's alive." I could feel the weight of her words settling over me, a suffocating heaviness that I could neither shake nor explain. Something was happening to this house, something that wasn't bound by logic or reason. The boundaries of reality seemed to be bending, breaking, just like the cracks in the mirrors and windows. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was in this house wasn't just haunting us, it was changing the house itself. And with each passing day, the threat grew more dangerous, more real. I could feel it now, pressing against the walls, seeping into the very foundation of our home. We weren't just living here anymore. We were trapped. And whatever was inside this place, whatever force was pulling the strings, wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The first night we heard it, I thought it was just a bad dream. It was late, far later than we usually stayed up, and the house was eerily still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards, the house settling into the cool night air. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened over the past few days. The broken vase, the cracks in the mirrors, the strange disappearance of things. All these strange occurrences weighed heavily on me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. But then I heard it. At first, it was just a whisper, barely perceptible over the wind outside. A soft murmur, like distant voices carried on the breeze. It could have been anything, a passing car, a noise from the house next door. But as I listened closer, the murmur became clearer. And then, unmistakable, it was a voice. A voice calling, whispering in the dark. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to make out the words. But all I could catch was a faint, incomprehensible mumble, a low murmur, like someone speaking just beyond the reach of my hearing. I turned to my wife. She was still asleep, her face soft and relaxed, but I could see the tension in her features, the faint furrow of her brow. It was like she could feel something too, something in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound grew louder, more distinct. I threw the covers off, my heart racing now, and stood up, making my way toward the door. The air in the hallway was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. As I stepped into the corridor, the voices became clearer, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice now. It was several. Muffled cries, low shouts, all merging together in a cacophony of sound. And then I heard it. A scream. Not a scream of fear. Not a scream of pain. But something worse, something desperate, raw, full of anguish. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the house, a sound that made my skin crawl. I froze, unable to move. The sound seemed to wrap itself around me, seeping into my bones, into my very soul. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down, suffocating me with its intensity. I rushed to the stairs, calling for my wife. Her voice cracked as she answered from the bedroom. "John? What's happening? What's going on?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The sound was all-consuming now. The house was filled with it. The walls were alive with it. And it was coming from all around us. From the floorboards. From the ceiling. From the very corners of the house. The voices were no longer whispers. They were screams, loud, echoing, unbearable. I reached the living room only to find my son, Henry, standing by the front door, his wide eyes filled with terror. He was shaking, his small body rigid with fear. "Daddy," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the screams. "Who's in the house?" I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The walls were trembling now, the entire house vibrating under the force of the sound. The voices, the cries, they didn't stop. They only grew louder, more frenzied. I grabbed Henry and pulled him close to me, trying to shield him from the noise, but it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on us. I could feel my wife behind me, clutching my arm, her grip cold with fear. "John, we have to leave," she said, her voice panicked. "We have to get out of here." But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything except stand there, paralyzed by the noise, the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to fill every inch of the house. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. The air felt thick and suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. For a moment, I thought it might have been a trick of my mind, a nightmare brought to life. But then, from the darkness, came a new sound. A thud. A deep, resonant thud that seemed to come from the very heart of the house. It was followed by another, and then another. They were slow, deliberate, like footsteps, but they didn't sound like they were coming from anywhere near us. They were too loud, too close. My wife and I exchanged a glance, both of us too terrified to speak. Henry clung to me, his small fingers digging into my shirt. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a voice. Clear, unmistakable, and this time it was not a whisper. Get out, before it's too late. We stood frozen, the weight of the words pressing down on us, as the house seemed to breathe around us, alive with its dark presence. I had no idea how long we stood there, trapped in that suffocating silence. But I knew one thing for certain now, this house wasn't just haunted, it was trying to claim us. And if we didn't find a way to leave, we might never escape. In the days that followed, something shifted in Henry. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of the move, the tension in the house. But I couldn't ignore it for long. He stopped talking to us. No more laughing or playing with his toys in the living room. He spent most of his time in his room, doors closed, blinds drawn tight. When I asked him what he was doing, he would simply say, talking to my friend. But when I pressed him further, he would look at me with wide, vacant eyes and shrug, his small voice barely above a whisper. He likes it when I talk to him. I'd often hear his voice in the room, but it wasn't the cheerful tone of a child's imagination. No, this was different. It was as if you were having a conversation with someone, or something that I couldn't see. I would knock on his door, asking if he needed anything, but he would always tell me the same thing. I'm fine, Dad. Just talking to him. But it wasn't just the isolation that worried me, it was the bruises. At first, they were small, easy to overlook. A faint mark on his arm, a light scrape on his leg. I chalked it up to rough play, maybe a fall or a bump. But then the marks began to get worse, more pronounced. Dark, angry bruises appeared on his arms, his back, even his face. They weren't the kind of bruises that come from running around or stumbling during a fall. They looked deliberate, like someone had gripped him too tightly or dragged him across something rough. Henry, what happened? I asked one evening, my voice laced with concern as I knelt beside him. He was sitting on the floor in the hallway, drawing something in his sketchbook, his head down, his hair falling over his eyes. It's nothing, he said quietly, his voice flat, devoid of its usual energy. He didn't mean to. Who, Henry? I asked, my voice trembling now, a sickening sense of dread creeping over me. Who didn't mean to? But my son just stared at me, his eyes glassy, unfocused. It's okay, Dad. He doesn't want me to talk about it. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I looked at him, trying to make sense of his words. Who doesn't want you to talk about it, Henry? But before he could answer, he simply stood up and walked past me, his gaze fixed on something far away, his movements unnaturally stiff. As he passed me, I noticed that his arms, once again, were covered in fresh bruises. They were darker this time, deeper, like they had been inflicted with more force. I turned to follow him, but hesitated. What could I say to him? What could I do? It felt like he was slipping away from me, becoming more distant, more unreachable with each passing day. That night, I checked on him before bed. His door was slightly ajar, and I peeked in, expecting to find him lying in bed, eyes closed in sleep. But instead, I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, but his head was slightly tilted, as though he were listening intently to something. I couldn't hear any voices, but the silence in the room felt wrong. It was thick, suffocating. "Henry," I called softly, stepping into the room. He didn't respond at first, his gaze still fixed on the empty space in front of him. I took a few steps closer, my heart racing. "Henry?" Finally, he turned to look at me, and when he did, his eyes were cold. Not the warm, innocent eyes of my son, but something darker, something hollow. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. It was like he wasn't there, like the boy I had known had been replaced by someone else. "He's here, Dad," Henry said, his voice barely audible. "He's waiting for you." Before I could ask what he meant, he got up and walked to the window, his back to me. His hands pressed against the glass, his face reflected in the pain, but his eyes weren't looking at me. They were locked on something outside, something I couldn't see. I reached for him, trying to pull him away from the window, but as I touched his shoulder, he flinched violently, spinning around to face me. "Don't," he shouted, his voice suddenly fierce. "He'll get mad if you touch me." I recoiled, taken aback by the force in his words. Henry had never spoken to me like that before. It wasn't my son anymore, this was something else. Something darker. "Henry, please," I pleaded, my voice shaking. "We need to talk. What's happening to you?" But Henry just shook his head slowly, a twisted, unnatural smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You'll understand soon, Dad. You'll see him too. He'll make you see." And with that, he turned away from me, walking back to his bed and lying down as though nothing had happened. His eyes closed, and in a moment he was silent again, his breathing slow and even, as if nothing had disturbed him. I stood in the doorway, frozen in place, staring at my son's motionless form. The house felt colder now. It felt like something was waiting, watching. I didn't know if it was the house or my son, but whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had all of us. And I had no idea how to stop it. Emma had always been the logical one. She didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. She preferred to explain the unexplainable with reason. But even she couldn't ignore the strange things that had been happening in the house. And when Henry began to change, something inside her seemed to snap. She knew we couldn't just keep pretending it was all in our heads. There had to be an explanation. One afternoon, while I was at work, Emma decided to do some digging. She had been in the attic earlier that week, sorting through boxes we hadn't yet unpacked. But it was only that day that she found something significant. Something that, in retrospect, she shouldn't have looked at. When I came home, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she flipped through a thick, old journal. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. "John," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "You need to see this." I walked over to her, glancing at the journal she held. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like it had been kept in the attic for decades. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though I could feel the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "I found it in the attic," she said, her voice still shaky. "It belongs to the woman who lived here before us. Her name was Margaret Reynolds. The house, it wasn't always like this. I think the house did this to her." I sat down across from her and peered at the open page. The handwriting was neat but slanted, as if written in haste, and the words were soaked with fear. Emma began reading aloud, her voice low. "March 12th, 1968. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. At night, the walls speak to me. I hear whispers, cold breath against my neck, and the shadows move in ways that defy explanation. I wake up every morning with bruises I don't remember getting. Sometimes, I feel like I'm not alone, but I never see anyone. The house feels alive. And it's watching me. It's watching all of us. Margaret, is that my name? Asterisk. Emma stopped reading, her voice trembling. I could see her fingers shaking as she turned the page. March 22nd, 1968. I'm losing my mind. The whispers aren't just voices anymore, they're commands. I've started seeing things. Shadows that aren't my own. Figures in the corners of my vision. But it's not just me. The others are starting to feel it too. I can see the fear in their eyes. It's not just in my head, I know it. The house is changing us. It's taking over. And there's no escape, asterisk. Emma closed the journal and stared at it, her eyes wide and filled with dread. John, this is exactly what's happening to us. The bruises, the whispers. Henry talking to someone who isn't there. This is exactly what Margaret experienced. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. I felt a chill run down my spine, a bone-deep cold that seemed to settle in my chest. The house, it did this to her, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I was just imagining things, but it's real. Whatever's here, it's trying to take us, just like it did to her. I stood up abruptly, my mind racing. What does she say about how to stop it? I asked, desperate for some clue, anything that could help us. Emma flipped through the pages frantically, her eyes scanning the text. But when she reached the end of the journal, her face turned ashen. There's no more. The last entry, March 28th, it's just a date. No more words. The pages are torn after that. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. What happened to her, Emma? Did she just disappear? I don't know, she said, her voice distant, lost in thought. But I'm starting to think that whatever is in this house doesn't just want to scare us. It wants us. It wants to take us, like it took Margaret. I stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me, suffocating me. The idea that the house wasn't just haunted, but that it had a purpose to consume us, to erase us from existence, was too much to bear. And yet, I couldn't deny what had been happening. Then we have to leave, I said, my voice thick with panic. We can't stay here. We're not safe. But Emma shook her head, a quiet, resigned sadness in her eyes. I don't think we can leave, John. It's already too late. Whatever is here, it's already attached to us. I looked over at Henry's room, the door cracked open just a sliver, as though inviting me in. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had no idea what the house wanted, but I was beginning to fear it was already too late to stop it. It was well past midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had stirred me, maybe a shift in the air, or the quiet hum of the house settling into the night, but something felt wrong. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to dismiss the unease that gripped my chest. The house was too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, fills the air with a weight that makes it hard to breathe. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards somewhere in the distance, and then, nothing. I glanced over at Emma, her face bathed in the pale glow of moonlight coming through the curtains. She was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. But something in me told me that it wasn't just the stillness of the night that was making my pulse race. there was something else, something in the shadows of the room that made my heart skip. I slowly swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. The chill in the room seemed to wrap around me, a sense of heaviness that pressed against my skin. I stood quietly, my breath shallow, trying not to wake him up. My mind was racing. I knew I had to check on Henry. I had to make sure he was all right. The bruises, his strange behavior, it had all been spiraling out of control, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house, waiting to take him. I slipped out of the bedroom and crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The house was unnervingly still, every step I took seeming to echo louder than it should. I reached Henry's door and stood there for a moment, listening. It was silent, but I could feel the air around me shift, like the house itself was holding its breath. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moonlight that filtered through the blinds. I could make out the shape of Henry's bed, the outline of his small body beneath the covers. But then, my eyes locked onto something in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some shadow cast in the wrong direction. But as I blinked, I saw it more clearly. A figure, dark, indistinct, standing at the foot of Henry's bed. It was tall, unnaturally still, as if waiting for something. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was in the shape of a person, but the outline was wrong. It was too dark, too solid, its edges blending into the shadows like it wasn't fully there, like it was made of the darkness itself. I took a step forward, my hand reaching out instinctively, but the moment I moved, the figure shifted. It was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I rushed into the room, my eyes darting frantically around, trying to find any trace of it. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the house and the faint rustling of the blinds in the wind. Henry was still asleep, his small form curled under the covers, his face peaceful in slumber. But my heart hammered in my chest, the terror of what I had seen gripping me. I hadn't imagined it, I knew I hadn't. The figure had been real, standing right there by his bed. I took a few shaky steps closer to Henry, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his forehead. He was cold. Too cold. I pulled my hand back quickly, my mind racing. Had it been real? Had it been a dream? I glanced around the room one more time, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed deeper here, like they were closing in. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get away from this place. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Not until I knew what had been in that room with him. I turned to leave, my legs weak beneath me, but just before I stepped out, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, just at the edge of my hearing. It's not over yet. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice had come from behind me, no, not from Henry's bed, but from inside the room, as if the walls themselves were speaking. I whipped around, but again, there was nothing. No one. Just the cold emptiness of the room. I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this was, whatever presence had been haunting the house, it wasn't just playing games anymore. It was hunting us. It was hunting Henry. And whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had us all. I returned to our room, my thoughts a blur, my hands still shaking. I lay down beside Emma, but sleep was no longer a comfort. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing the shadow again, the tall, dark figure standing at Henry's side. And I knew, deep down, that we were all in its sights now. I couldn't sleep. The shadows in the house had begun to feel like more than just a trick of the light. They were waiting, lurking, creeping closer every night. The air felt different now, thicker, as if the house was breathing, alive with something dark and malevolent. Emma noticed it, too. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes when she looked at Henry. He was still acting strangely, talking to his invisible friend, and the bruises on his arms had become harder to explain away. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, adjusting to the new house, the move, the isolation, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I tried to calm myself. Rational thought, logic, that's what I needed. I wasn't going to fall prey to some wild superstition. There had to be a logical explanation for everything happening in this house. It couldn't be ghosts, could it? The more I tried to reason it out, the more absurd it all seemed, and yet the events kept escalating. That night in Henry's room, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the whisper. I needed answers. So, I did what anyone in my position would do. I started researching. I spent hours online, reading articles and watching videos on poltergeists and paranormal phenomena. I dug into every possible explanation, from psychological factors to environmental disturbances. But the more I read, the more the lines between logic and the supernatural began to blur. The accounts of other people who had experienced similar events were uncanny, almost identical to what we were going through. Strange noises, moving objects, unexplained bruises, the stories were all too familiar. I moved from the computer to the bookshelves. We hadn't unpacked all the boxes yet, but I knew we had a collection of old books from Emma's parents' house. I wasn't sure why they were in the attic, but something told me there might be a clue there. Among the dusty, forgotten volumes, one book caught my attention. It was old, its leather cover cracked and faded, and the title was barely visible. I wiped the dust away and squinted at the words, Poltergeist Phenomena, the Unseen Forces. It wasn't a book I'd ever noticed before, but something about it drew me in. Maybe I was desperate for an answer, any answer. I flipped through the pages, reading passages aloud to myself as I tried to make sense of the chaos swirling in my mind. The book outlined the basic characteristics of poltergeist activity, objects moving on their own, loud noises, disturbing visions, all the things we had been experiencing. But the real shock came when I read deeper into the case studies. According to the book, these entities weren't just random spirits. They were manifestations, a type of poltergeist that seemed to grow stronger with fear and negative energy. I paused. It was strange how closely this mirrored our experiences. The fear we felt in this house, it had been building ever since we moved in. The more we feared it, the stronger it seemed to get. But there was something more disturbing in the text. The book mentioned that these types of entities often targeted vulnerable individuals, feeding off their emotional energy. I thought about Henry. He had been the first to notice the shadows, the first to see the invisible friend. He was scared, but he was also a child, his mind open and impressionable. I wondered, maybe he was the one the entity was trying to claim. I slammed the book shut and stood up, my thoughts a whirlwind. I needed more answers, but I wasn't sure where to turn next. This wasn't just some haunting, some mischievous spirit playing tricks on us. It felt personal, like whatever was in this house wanted something from us. I looked out the window. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the backyard, its pale light making the trees look like twisted shadows. I felt it then, a presence, something heavy and suffocating, watching me from the darkness. That's when it hit me. We weren't going to be able to just ignore it. We couldn't just wait until it went away. If this was a poltergeist, then it had to be confronted, had to be challenged. We had to take control before it took us. But how? The book didn't offer any simple solutions. It talked about rituals, ways to banish the entity. But nothing seemed foolproof. I felt a pang of desperation as I thought about Emma and Henry. What if I was wrong? What if I made things worse by provoking it? I had no choice, though. I couldn't let this thing get to my family. Whatever was haunting this house, it was feeding our fear, and the longer we did nothing, the stronger it would get. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't know if I was strong enough to face it. The decision to call someone in wasn't easy. I had been resisting the idea for days, weeks, really, but the more I researched, the clearer it became we weren't dealing with an ordinary haunting. Whatever was in this house was active, malevolent, and growing stronger by the day. We needed help. I found the number of a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Valerie Graves. She came highly recommended, with a reputation for dealing with particularly aggressive entities. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe someone who would come in, make a few proclamations, and tell us to move on with our lives. But that wasn't what I got. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 in the morning. Valerie was shorter than I expected, wearing dark jeans and a leather jacket that seemed at odds with the seriousness of the situation. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was a kind of warmth in her gaze, something reassuring. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You called about a poltergeist?" she asked, her voice steady and confident. It wasn't a question. She clearly dealt with worse. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Emma was already in the living room, Henry beside her, playing quietly with his toys. Valerie studied the room for a moment before speaking again. "Has anything moved recently? Objects? Sounds?" I glanced at Emma, and she gave a small, uncertain nod. "Yes," she said quietly. Things move on their own. And the noises, we hear things, whispers, footsteps, when no one's around." Valerie didn't seem surprised. She motioned for us to follow her as she walked slowly through the house, her eyes scanning every corner. She stopped at the top of the stairs, peering down into the dark hallway that led to the basement. "It's here," she said, almost as if she were confirming something to herself. "The energy in this house is strong. I can feel it." I swallowed hard, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I had tried so hard to explain this away, stress, the house settling, old pipes, but every time I looked into Valerie's eyes, I knew I couldn't keep lying to myself. There was something here. Something I didn't understand. Valerie turned to face us, her expression serious. "This house is a conduit," she said quietly. "It's been feeding off your fear, your stress. That's how poltergeists work. They manipulate their environment, move things around, create disturbances, but they're also manipulating you, your emotions. It makes them stronger." Emma's face paled. "So, what does that mean for us? Is there a way to get rid of it?" Valerie hesitated for a moment before answering. "Not easily. The longer you stay, the more entrenched the energy becomes. It's not just a ghost, it's a manifestation, an entity that is formed because of the negativity and emotional trauma tied to this house. It feeds on fear, and it's using your son as a focal point." My stomach dropped. "Henry?" She nodded gravely. "Yes. Children are particularly vulnerable to this type of energy. Their emotions are raw, their imaginations open. It's drawn to them because it can influence them more easily. The bruises, the strange behavior, it's all part of the entity's influence. I looked over at Henry, still playing with his toys, oblivious to the conversation unfolding around him. He seemed so innocent, so unaware of what was happening, but I knew better. I had seen the changes in him, the way he'd started talking to himself, the way his eyes seemed to dart around the room as if he were seeing something none of us could. Valerie took a deep breath and stepped closer. "You can leave, you know. It might be the safest thing to do. Take Henry, leave the house. Get as far away from this place as possible." I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. But what if we don't? What if we stay? She looked at me, her expression softening just a little, but there was no denying the gravity in her words. Then it will only get worse. The entity will grow more powerful, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She sighed, glancing toward the stairs again, as though the answer was right there, hiding in the shadows. It's hard to say. Sometimes they want to claim a person, sometimes they just want to drive the family out. Either way, the longer you stay, the more dangerous it becomes. It will become harder and harder to leave, and harder to fight it off. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of her words. I looked at Emma, who was still holding Henry's hand, her face pale. I knew she was terrified. Hell, I was terrified, but I also knew that we couldn't just run. We couldn't let this thing win. "I'll do what I can," Valerie said after a moment, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken warning. "But you need to make a choice. Leave or fight it." The words echoed in my mind as we walked her to the door. I could hear the wind howling outside, the branches scraping against the windows like claws. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew that she was right. We were running out of time. Whatever was in this house, it wasn't going to stop. And if we stayed, it would only get worse. I had no idea how much worse, but I couldn't ignore the look in Valerie's eyes. Whatever this thing wanted, it wasn't done with us. Not yet. And I wasn't sure we were going to make it out alive. The decision was made. We had no choice but to confront this thing head on. Valerie, despite her warnings, agreed to conduct a session in her home, a last-ditch effort to understand the nature of the entity that had taken over. She prepared herself, bringing tools I could hardly recognize, candles, incense, a strange bundle of herbs, and an old, worn pendant that she claimed would help protect her during the ritual. We gathered in the living room, the same place where I had first heard the unsettling whispers, where Henry had seen the shadows. The room felt colder now, even though it was a warm spring day outside. The temperature dropped noticeably when Valerie lit the candles, their flickering flames casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. She instructed us to sit in a circle, to remain as still and quiet as possible. "The energy in this house is volatile," she explained. "It's important to stay calm and focused. If we lose control, it could spiral out of hand." I nodded, but I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest. Henry was still by my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly, his eyes wide with fear. Emma sat across from us, her gaze nervously darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. For a few moments, there was silence, unnerving silence. Only the crackling of the candles broke the stillness. But then, something shifted. A slight whisper, barely audible, seemed to stir the air. I looked at Valerie, who was concentrating hard, her eyes closed in a trance-like state. Her lips moved silently as though she were speaking to something invisible, something that I couldn't hear. Then, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles, and for a brief moment, the room plunged into darkness. The air felt heavier, as if a dark presence was pushing down on us. I heard a faint scratching noise, like claws on wood, coming from above, only there was no one else in the house. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Valerie's eyes shot open, and for the first time since we'd met her, I saw fear in her expression. "Something's here," she whispered, barely audible. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the pendant around her neck, clutching it tightly as though it might offer her protection. "Stay calm, stay focused." But it was too late. A loud crash erupted from the kitchen, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Emma gasped, and Henry, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly screamed, his voice high-pitched and filled with terror. I turned to look at him, but before I could say anything, a chair behind me was flung across the room with a deafening bang, narrowly missing my head. The room was no longer still. The atmosphere had turned chaotic, the air thick with an almost tangible hostility. I looked back at Valerie, whose face had turned pale. She stood frozen in place, staring at the far corner of the room, her mouth agape. Then came the sounds, louder now, deep, guttural growls that seemed to reverberate through the walls, the very floor beneath our feet vibrating. The temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath in the air. I glanced toward the hallway and saw movement, shadows racing across the walls, flickering in the dim light like something alive. The once calm, almost cozy living room had turned into a war zone. Everything seemed to move of its own accord. Books flew off shelves, pictures tumbled to the floor, and the windows rattled violently in their frames. And then, a voice, low, distorted, as if coming from the very bowels of the house. It was not human, not anything I had ever heard before. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, its tone mocking, cruel. Valerie's eyes widened in terror. "We need to leave." "Now!" she shouted, her voice breaking. She reached for her bag, but before she could grab it, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. Panic set in. The walls seemed to close in around us, and I felt the suffocating pressure of something closing in, tightening like a noose. Valerie stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "It's too strong," she muttered, her voice shaking. "I can't control it. We need to leave now." But it was too late. The energy in the room had become too intense, too unpredictable. The room itself seemed to be alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. Suddenly, a loud, ear-splitting crash came from behind us, and I turned just in time to see the old grandfather clock fall forward, its heavy wooden frame splintering as it crashed to the ground. With a strangled scream, Valerie turned and fled, her footsteps echoing as she dashed toward the front door. But it slammed shut in front of her, as if the house itself were refusing to let her leave. I looked back at Henry, whose eyes were wide with terror, his face pale and drawn. He was shaking, and I could see his lips moving, whispering to someone or something out of sight. Emma grabbed him tightly, trying to pull him away from the chaos, but it was as though the very walls were against us. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, surrounded by the echo of violent, unseen forces. A loud bang, followed by a horrible scraping sound, made my heart stop in my chest. It was like the walls themselves were being ripped apart. And then, in the silence that followed, Valerie's voice, faint, terrified, reached us from the other side of the door. Get out now, she whimpered, her voice barely recognizable. But it was too late. The house had us. The entity had us. And it wasn't going to let us go. The house seemed to breathe around us, alive with some malevolent force, its walls groaning and creaking under the weight of whatever was stirring inside. The air was thick with dread, suffocating, as though the house itself had taken on a life of its own. We couldn't escape it. We couldn't fight it. Valerie was gone. She had fled into the night, leaving us behind in the chaos she had stirred. The door slammed behind her with a finality that echoed through the house like a death knell. And in that moment, I felt the terror settle deep into my bones. We were alone now. Alone with whatever had taken root in this place. But then, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of cracking glass. It started with a high-pitched, shuddering crack that sliced through the room, making my heart skip a beat. I turned, my eyes widening in horror as the first mirror in the hallway split in two, the jagged pieces falling to the floor with a sharp clatter. But it wasn't the sound that stopped me. No, it was what I saw in the reflection. The shattered glass didn't just reflect the empty hallway, it seemed to distort, twist, into something else. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a face. But not just any face. It was pale, twisted, contorted into a grotesque expression of pain and terror. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the feeling it left behind remained, an icy hand clenching at my throat. Before I could say anything, another mirror, this one in the living room, cracked with a deafening sound. And then another. And another. One by one, each mirror in the house shattered in unison, sending a wave of panic through me. I watched in horror as the faces in the mirrors, those ghastly, blurred shapes, seemed to multiply. I rushed to the nearest mirror, the one hanging above the fireplace. Its surface trembled, vibrating as though the spirits themselves were trying to break free. The glass splintered with a horrible shriek, and for just a moment, I saw a dozen faces, twisted, ghostly, their eyes wide in silent screams. They stared back at me, trapped in the fragments of glass, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. But it wasn't just the faces in the mirrors that made my blood run cold. It was the way they moved. They shifted, rearranging themselves, as though they were coming closer. As though they wanted to reach through the glass, grab me, drag me into whatever nightmare they were trapped in. Henry! I screamed, spinning around to find my son. But he was no longer by my side. I could hear his breathing, shallow, erratic, coming from the other room. I ran to him, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I passed the hallway, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The hallway mirrors, every single one, was now filled with those faces. Some were indistinct, others twisted in unimaginable shapes, their eyes wild with fear or anger. They were no longer trapped behind the glass. They were free, roaming through the fractured reflections, their figures contorting unnaturally, stretching and pulling in ways that defied logic. In the living room, the mirror above the couch shattered in a violent explosion of glass, scattering shards across the floor like a storm. And as the pieces hit the ground, the faces within them shifted. I saw the same woman over and over, her face pale, hollow eyes staring directly at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The next instant, her face was replaced by another, an older man with a twisted, mocking grin. I stumbled backward, my legs weak with fear. I could feel the presence closing in around me, pressing down like a physical weight. The air itself felt dense, suffocating. It was as if every mirror, every shard of glass, was now a window into some hellish realm where these lost souls were imprisoned. "Stop! Please!" I yelled at the mirrors, desperate, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the dark force filling the room. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, the mirrors stopped. The glass had stopped cracking, and the faces, for the moment, were still. I felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe it was over, maybe the entity had backed off, but the silence that followed was even worse than the chaos. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, from behind me, I heard Henry's voice, soft and trembling. "Daddy, what's wrong with the mirrors?" I spun around, my heart sinking. Henry stood at the entrance to the living room, his small hands clutching a toy, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, staring at the broken mirrors. The moment our eyes met, I felt a chill spread across my skin, a deep, visceral cold that cut straight to my bones. Henry wasn't just frightened. He wasn't seeing what I was seeing. He was part of it. The realization hit me like a slap across the face. Whatever had taken hold of this house, whatever had turned the mirrors into portals for those cursed souls, was using Henry. The entity wasn't just a presence. It was alive, and it was feeding off his fear. Before I could move, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the hallways, soft, like dragging feet. Then came the whispers, low, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. The walls seemed to close in around me, the mirrors reflecting not just the room, but something more, something dark and ancient, something that had been trapped for far too long. "Henry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Get away from the mirrors." But it was already too late. The faces in the shattered glass seemed to stir, their eyes shifting, tracking him, moving with unnatural precision. They were coming for him. The more I looked, the more I could see them, pale hands reaching out, grasping at the space between the shards, as if trying to pull themselves free. And then, just as the whispers grew louder, a voice, low and familiar, rose from the shattered glass. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone in the room. It was something else, something from inside the house. "Join us," it hissed. I turned to Henry, and his eyes were wide, almost vacant, like he was looking right through me. I reached out to him, but the air between us crackled with an invisible force, a barrier that I couldn't cross. The mirrors were no longer reflections. They had become windows into the dark. And I knew, without a doubt, that there was no going back. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding as the air around me thickened with dread. The whispers from the mirrors were no longer distant murmurs. They were loud, pressing on my mind, urging me to stay, to give in to whatever it was that had taken root in this house. The coldness had spread beyond the mirrors, creeping into the very walls, filling the air with a sense of finality. I needed to act. I had to protect my family. I turned to Henry, my throat tight with fear. His small, pale face stared back at me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Something wasn't right with him. His eyes were empty, distant, as though he wasn't really there anymore. He wasn't my son, at least, not entirely. He had become a vessel, a puppet to whatever force had taken hold of this house. "Henry!" I shouted, my voice shaking with desperation. "We have to leave. Now. Do you hear me? We have to get out of here." I ran toward him, my hands trembling as I reached out to grab his shoulders. But he flinched back, his face scrunching up in fear, yet his eyes remained cold and vacant. "No, I can't go," he whispered, his voice distant and hollow. He won't let me." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who won't let you?" A chill crept up my spine as he pointed toward the shattered mirror, where the fractured faces seemed to twist and contort with every movement of the shards. I'd followed his finger, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing just behind the glass, their hand pressed against the broken surface, their eyes locked onto Henry with an unnatural hunger. I recoiled, shaking my head. It was the thing that had been haunting us. The entity, the presence in the house. It had ensnared my son. I could feel it tightening its grip, dragging him deeper into its web. "No, Henry," I said, my voice breaking as I knelt before him. "We need to leave. Whatever this thing is, it's not your friend. It's using you." But he didn't respond. His eyes darted to the door, then back to the mirror, his expression growing distant once more. A low, rasping voice seemed to fill the room, whispering in the shadows, just out of reach of my hearing. Henry's lips parted as though he was about to speak, but it wasn't his voice that emerged. "He'll stay. He can't leave," the voice echoed, deep and dark, resonating through the walls, vibrating in my chest. It was a low, guttural sound, like the growl of some ancient beast, impossibly far away yet incredibly close. The voice was in the room with us, an oppressive, malevolent presence that seemed to be both inside and outside at the same time. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get him out. I had to save my family. But the fear that gripped my heart was undeniable. The house wasn't just alive. It was alive with the souls of those who had been trapped here. And now it had latched onto Henry. It was holding him hostage. I grabbed his arm, my hands tight around him as I pulled him toward the door. But he resisted. "I can't leave, Daddy. He told me to stay. He said I have to stay, forever." I could feel my strength faltering as I tried to pull him, but Henry was like dead weight, his small body unwilling to move. I looked at him, pleading, my throat tight with emotion. His eyes, once filled with innocence, now seemed empty, lost, distant, as though his soul had already been claimed by whatever dark force haunted this house. "Henry, please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I will protect you. I will fight whatever this is. Just come with me." But he shook his head slowly, his lips trembling as the words came out in a whisper. "He says you can't protect me. He says we're all his now." The room felt colder, colder than ever before, as if the temperature itself had plummeted to the point of freezing. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching for us, drawn toward the boy who was now the center of their attention. I could see the outlines of the faces in the mirrors, their eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light, their mouths moving in silent curses. I couldn't give up on him. I wouldn't. "We're leaving, Henry. Now." But he didn't move. His eyes glazed over, and I could hear a faint, sinister hum, like a vibration from the very walls themselves. The air seemed to thicken, the pressure mounting. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my son, my little boy, wasn't with me. He was lost. Suddenly, a violent shudder rocked the house, and the door slammed shut with a force that sent me stumbling backward. I looked up in panic, my heart racing. The walls trembled, the house groaning under some unseen force. And then I heard it. A soft, mocking laugh echoing from deep within the house, low, hollow, and cold. It was the same voice, the one that had spoken through Henry. The house wasn't just alive, it was alive with hunger. In that moment, I realized something even more terrifying. I was not the one in control. This house had taken Henry, and now it wanted all of us. And it wasn't going to let us go. I reached for him again, but the force that had taken him held firm. As I touched his hand, I felt a jolt like an electric shock sweeping through me. His body jerked back violently, his eyes glowing with unnatural light. The house was trying to break me. It was trying to tear us apart. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. I gritted my teeth, mustering every ounce of strength I had left. We're getting out, Henry. We're getting out. But he didn't respond. And I feared it was too late. The house erupted into chaos, as if it had come alive with an insatiable fury. It was no longer just strange occurrences, no longer just whispers and shadows. It was a full-fledged assault on our sanity, our bodies, our very souls. The lights flickered wildly, casting erratic flashes of light and darkness, like the house itself was breathing, pulsating with a malevolent energy. The power surged, then cut out completely, plunging us into an oppressive darkness, broken only by the eerie glow from the shattered mirrors and the glowing, unblinking eyes that stared back at us from the walls. I stood frozen, clutching Henry's hand in mine, but it felt like I was holding on to nothing. The weight of the house, the weight of this entity pressing in around us, was too much. The temperature had dropped drastically, the chill crawling under my skin, numbing me from the inside out. My breath came out in ragged clouds of frost. A sudden crash echoed through the house, sharp and jarring, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor above us, then a series of violent thuds as if someone, or something, was smashing the walls, attacking from every direction. Every surface trembled as though the house itself were shaking in rage. The doors slammed open and shut violently, without warning, as though an unseen force was trying to trap us. One moment, they were wide open, the next, they were locked fast, refusing to budge, trapping us in this nightmare. The walls groaned under the strain, a low, mournful sound that reverberated through my chest. The windows rattled as though something was trying to break through from the outside, but the house wouldn't let it. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The house was more than just a place now. It had become a living, breathing force. A predator that had been waiting, biding its time until it had us where it wanted us. "Henry, we need to move." I shouted, but my voice barely carried over the rising cacophony of noise that filled the house. Every step I took seemed to send the house into more of a frenzy. The lights flashed again, blinding me for a moment, then went out completely, leaving us in suffocating darkness. I could feel the pressure building. It was as though the air itself had become thicker, denser. Every breath felt labored, like I was suffocating. And through the pounding of my heart, through the deafening noise, I could still hear it, voices. Soft, barely audible whispers, but they were there, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very space around me. Then came a terrible sound, something scraping across the floor, dragging its way toward us, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. I could hear it growing closer, the scratching sound against it growing louder and more frantic. It was coming for us. The air around us seemed to warp and twist. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing against my chest, pushing the very breath out of me. I turned to Henry, but his face was a mask of confusion, terror in his wide eyes. He stood motionless, frozen in place. And then I saw it. From the corner of the room, in the shadows, something stirred. A shape, darker than the night itself, was moving toward us, an indistinct figure, but its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural, eerie light. They locked onto me, and in that moment, I felt a coldness unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, gnawing terror that gripped my soul. I reached for Henry, pulling him toward me, but the darkness was too close now. I could feel it closing in, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on us. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from above us, below us, all around us. The mirrors cracked, splintering into hundreds of jagged pieces. The shards reflected ghostly faces, contorted in pain and rage, their mouths moving as though they were trying to speak, scream, but their voices were drowned out by the relentless noise that surrounded us. The floor beneath us suddenly gave way with a sickening creak, and the house trembled violently, like it was about to collapse in on itself. I grabbed Henry tighter, pulling him away from the edge of the floorboard that was buckling beneath our feet. "Come on, Henry. We have to get out." I screamed, but he didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, glazed over, locked on something I couldn't see. Then, the thing, whatever it was, appeared. A shadow in the form of a human, but impossibly tall, its limbs distorted, stretching and bending unnaturally as it crawled toward us. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence wrapping around us like a vice. It moved toward Henry, who stood there, still, as if waiting for it to come. My heart thudded in my chest. I couldn't let this happen. I pulled Henry into my arms, hoisting him up, and ran toward the front door. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, as though the house itself was closing in on us, unwilling to let us escape. In a moment of desperation, I reached for the nearest thing, a metal candlestick, swinging it with all my might toward the door. It shattered upon impact, the sound ringing through the house, a shrill, piercing noise that made my skin crawl. I shoved against the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The house was holding us inside. The shadowy figure was close now, too close, and I could feel the icy breath of it on the back of my neck. I screamed, not caring if the walls heard me. I had to get out. We had to survive. And then, the house seemed to hold its breath. For one fleeting moment, everything stopped. The noise, the shaking, the pressure, all of it stopped. The mirrors were silent. The walls stopped groaning. The air itself felt still. I looked around, bewildered. What had happened? But before I could process anything, Henry whispered, "No," muttered, a soft, eerie chant under his breath. And then I felt it. The coldest, darkest presence I had ever encountered wrapped itself around me. The house had claimed us. And in that moment, I realized there was no escaping. Not anymore. Not from the poltergeist of Salt Lake City. The house felt like it was shrinking around us. Every step we took seemed to press the walls in closer, suffocating us with an invisible force. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that wrapped around us like a vice. My mind raced as I desperately searched for an escape. But no matter where I turned, the house refused to let us go. We were trapped. "Emma!" I shouted, grabbing her arm as we moved frantically from room to room. "We need to get out. Now!" The fear in my voice was impossible to ignore, even as I tried to keep calm for Henry. She shook her head in disbelief. "The windows, they're sealed. It's like something is holding them shut." Her voice wavered, a mix of fear and confusion. I turned to the nearest window. It was as if the world outside had vanished into darkness, leaving only the distorted reflection of our own terrified faces. I pressed my hands against the cold glass, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though something invisible, something alive, was holding it in place. "Let us out!" I screamed, but the only response was the oppressive silence that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Henry clung to me, his small body trembling with fear, but he didn't say a word. His eyes, wide and distant, stared at the door that led to the hallway. He wasn't looking at us, he was looking at something else, something I couldn't see. The house groaned beneath our feet, its very bones creaking and twisting, as though it were alive. The walls began to pulse, moving in and out with the sound of slow, steady breathing. The lights flickered again, casting grotesque shadows across the room. I could feel the house's heartbeat in the pit of my stomach, a rhythm that seemed to slow and speed with every passing second. "Henry," I said, crouching to his level, "we have to stay together. We need to move. There has to be another way out." My voice was shaky, but I tried to remain calm for him. But Henry didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the door, and I saw the subtle shift in his expression. It was as if he was hearing something I couldn't. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, the sound began. It was soft at first, a whisper, barely audible over the deafening silence. But it grew louder until it was a full-blown cacophony, like 1,000 voices speaking all at once, each one distorted and overlapping. I covered my ears, the pressure in my head unbearable. "What is that?" Emma cried, her face pale with terror. "Where is it coming from?" The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a low murmur that sent chills crawling down my spine. It was as if the house was speaking to us, taunting us, whispering its secrets in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor above us. The walls trembled as if the entire structure were in agony. The lights flickered again, casting everything in an unsettling strobe effect. Each flash revealed new horrors, shadows that danced across the walls, strange shapes that didn't belong. The house was twisting itself into something unrecognizable, something alive. I rushed to the front door, yanking at the handle, but it was locked tight. My heart raced as I pounded on the door, yelling for help, but no one could hear us. Not in this place. Not with whatever was lurking in the darkness. I turned to Emma, panic in my chest. "We need to break it down. We need to get out." My voice was hoarse from shouting. But when I reached for the nearest object to use as leverage, a heavy wooden chair, it too was thrown back across the room as if by some unseen hand. My heart skipped a beat. Something was toying with us. The house itself had become the enemy. We ran to the back door, hoping for a way out, but when I reached for the handle, the door exploded inward with such force that it sent me stumbling backward. The gust of wind that poured in from the outside was icy cold, and for a moment I thought we had finally made it. But it was only for a split second. The door slammed shut again, faster than I could react. The force was so strong that the windows rattled and the walls groaned under the pressure. I stood frozen, my hands still resting on the doorframe. Something wasn't right. We weren't just being trapped in a house. We were being trapped in this space, in this moment. It was like the house was rejecting us, refusing to let us leave. The lights flickered one last time before cutting out completely. In the darkness, the voices grew louder, swirling around us like an invisible storm, getting closer, closing in from all sides. My breath came out in short gasps, and I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. Henry. Emma, please. I begged, my voice shaking with a terror I couldn't contain. We have to stick together. We can't give up. But it was already too late. I heard it then. A sound that chilled me to my core, a low, guttural laugh, coming from somewhere in the walls. A laugh that was not human. The house was alive. And it was playing with us. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping in a way that made my breath visible, swirling in the dim light of the flickering room. I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a palpable presence, something that wasn't there before, but now stood in the middle of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the growing darkness. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, faint and flickering at the edge of my vision. But as I stared at the spot where it seemed to gather, it began to take shape. The shadow morphed slowly, like ink spreading across a page, until it formed into a tall, human-like figure. The outline was blurry, but there was no mistaking it, a silhouette of a man, but twisted, as if it was barely holding its shape together. It was standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the dim pool of light cast by the dying lamp. Its form shimmered and writhed, like smoke, but it was becoming more and more distinct. I could see a vague face, a distortion of features, but no eyes, only darkness. What do you want? I stammered, the words feeling like they were being dragged out of me. The figure didn't respond at first. It just loomed there, the air around it thick with an unbearable weight, the oppressive silence only broken by the faint echo of its breath, shallow and uneven. I could feel the presence pressing against me, a cold and oppressive force that seemed to wrap around my chest, squeezing tighter with every second. And then, in a voice that was not its own, but more like a chorus of whispers, it spoke. You must choose, it said, its voice a strange mix of broken whispers and sharp tones. One must be offered, to calm the hunger. I froze. My heart stopped. What are you talking about? I cried, my voice rising in panic. Who do you want? What do you mean, offered? The figure's form flickered again, as if it were struggling to hold its shape, its features distorting and shifting unnaturally. Then, the shadow stretched forward, its presence almost suffocating as it moved toward me, step by step. You must choose, the figure repeated, this time its voice cold, almost mocking. One will give their life, and the house will be at peace. The words hit me like a slap to the face. I took a step back, my knees shaking, my mind racing for some explanation, some way to reason with this thing that wasn't human. I glanced desperately at Emma and Henry. Emma's face was pale, her lips trembling as she held Henry close, but Henry wasn't scared. He was staring at the shadow, his eyes wide and filled with something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't looking at the shadow as if it were a threat. He was looking at it as if he knew it. I could feel the air in the room growing thick, suffocating. The shadows seemed to move closer, inch by inch, curling around the walls, narrowing the space until it felt like we were trapped in a small, suffocating box. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was paralyzed by fear, by the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. And then, the shadow spoke again, its voice darker now, more insistent. The one you protect will be the one to pay the price, it hissed, its form distorting as it leaned toward Henry. The child, he is the one who must give himself. I felt a surge of terror shoot through me like a bolt of lightning. The figure's words echoed in my mind, repeating like a drumbeat in my skull. I turned to Henry, my heart in my throat, and saw the same unblinking stare on his face. "No!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, raw with panic. "I won't let you take him. I won't let you." The shadow's laugh, low, guttural, and chilling, rippled through the room, sending a wave of dread crashing over me. Its dark tendrils reached out, almost gently, as if it were caressing the air itself. "You will choose," it crooned, its voice thick with menace. "The house will never release you until it feeds." I felt a sudden surge of anger, the raw emotion shooting through me, spurring me to move. I lunged forward, trying to shield Henry with my body, to place myself between the shadow and him. "No!" I screamed again. "You'll have to go through me." The figure seemed to flicker and waver, like it was testing my resolve, testing how far I would go. But then, with terrifying speed, it reached out toward me, its tendrils of darkness curling like snakes. I felt the coldness of its touch on my skin, icy and suffocating, as if I were being consumed by the very shadow of death. But in that moment, something snapped inside me. I couldn't let it take my son. I couldn't let it take any of us. I didn't care what the house wanted or what this thing demanded. I reached out with both hands, grabbed hold of the nearest object, anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around the handle of an old iron candlestick, and with every ounce of strength left in me, I swung it toward the shadow. There was a sickening, crackling sound as the candlestick collided with the shifting darkness. The shadow screeched, a high-pitched sound that shook the very walls, causing the room to tremble. The force of the blow sent it reeling back, and for a moment it hesitated, its form flickering wildly before it started to fade. But its eyes, the dark, empty hollows where its eyes should have been, locked onto me. "A final warning. You cannot escape," it whispered, fading into nothingness. "The hunger will never be sated until it takes what is owed." The shadow disappeared, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. The coldness remained, hanging in the air like a lingering curse. But the damage had been done. I knew that it wasn't over. The house, this place, had claimed us. And now, there was no escaping its grip. I stood frozen, my body shaking as I watched Henry move toward the darkness. It was like he wasn't even aware of the danger, like the shadow had him in a trance, pulling him closer to the heart of the house, toward the very room that had been the source of so much terror. "Henry!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Henry, no! Don't go near it." But he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. His small hand reached toward the doorway of the dark room, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. The shadows seemed to stretch out, curling like serpents around his wrist, pulling him forward with an unnatural force. "Henry, stop!" Emma screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. She moved toward him, but the room felt so large, as if the distance between us had suddenly grown impossible to bridge. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, feeding off his every step. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, the air thick with something that smelled of rot and decay. It was suffocating, as if the house itself was alive, trying to pull him into its depths. I rushed forward, my heart pounding in my ears, and grabbed Henry by the arm. I could feel the coldness of the shadow on his skin, seeping into me as I tugged him back. "Henry, come back!" I shouted, my voice strained with desperation. But he didn't budge. He just stood there, staring into the darkness with those unblinking eyes, as if someone, was calling to him. It was like the world had fallen away, like the only thing that mattered was the pull of the shadow, the pull of that room. My son, my sweet, innocent boy, was slipping away from me, lost to something I couldn't understand. Henry, please! Emma cried, her hands reaching out for him as she too approached, the panic in her eyes mirroring my own. But as I tried to pull him away from the door, I felt an overwhelming resistance, a force pulling back from the other side. It was like trying to drag him through a wall of solid stone, as though the house itself had grown stronger, more insistent. And then, the whisper came. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every second. The voice was cold, smooth, and slithering, like it was something that had never been human. Come, child, it cooed, the words echoing in the room. You belong here, with us. I turned to Emma, my face pale with horror. We have to pull him away. Now! Together, we yanked Henry back with every ounce of strength we had, but it was no use. The shadows seemed to tighten its grip, and suddenly Henry's small body jerked, resisting us, his hands slipping from mine as if some invisible force had grabbed him. No! Henry, come back! I cried, my voice breaking. But Henry didn't seem to hear me anymore. He was staring into the room with that same glassy, vacant expression, his body slack and unresisting. I could feel the weight of the shadow pulling at him, dragging him toward the darkness. The air was heavy with dread, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the shadows as they seemed to whisper his name. Suddenly, the room grew even colder. The temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath puffing out in front of me. The shadows seemed to dance, swirling faster and faster around Henry, as if they were preparing to consume him entirely. Henry, please! Emma sobbed, grabbing his arm and tugging with all her might. But it was as if we were fighting against something far stronger than us, a force that had existed in this house for longer than we could comprehend. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and the air thickened with an overwhelming sense of malevolent intent. I looked at Emma, and in that moment, I saw it, the terror in her eyes, the horror of what was happening to our son. We couldn't do it alone. Henry! I shouted, my voice ragged with fear. Snap out of it. And then, in a flash of desperation, I remembered the camera, the one we had found hidden in the wall with the old photos. The one that had shown the faces of the previous occupants. I had seen their terrified expressions, their eyes wide with something worse than fear. Could it be? Was this some sort of curse? A curse that had claimed them and now claimed us? I ran toward the camera, which was still sitting on the table, and grabbed it. I fumbled with the old device, my hands shaking. The lens was cracked, but the film inside was still there. I had to do something, anything, to snap Henry out of this trance. I held the camera up and snapped a picture, not knowing what it might show, but desperate to find anything that could stop the dark force that was pulling my son away. The flash of light was blinding in the dark room, and for a moment everything stopped. The shadows seemed to pause, flickering in midair. Henry's body jerked, and his head snapped to look at me, his eyes suddenly filled with confusion, as if he were waking from a deep sleep. Dad, he whispered, his voice hoarse, weak. What's happening? I pulled him into my arms, clutching him as if my life depended on it. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and distorting, as if the very light from the camera had weakened it. The darkness around us seemed to shudder, and then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it began to retreat. I held Henry close, breathing heavily, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only bought ourselves a moment. The house was still there. The hunger was still there. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of this cursed place, the shadow was waiting. The tension in the room was suffocating. The shadows that had once seemed so overwhelming, so impossible to escape, were now flickering and fading like a dying flame. My hands were still clutching Henry, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around at Emma, her face pale but determined. We were still trapped in this nightmare, but something had shifted. I could feel it. "Henry," I whispered, my voice shaking as I pulled him tighter against me. "You're safe now. We're together. We'll get out of here." But the shadows weren't done with us. I could feel them crawling along the walls, skittering at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. The air was still thick with fear, but now there was something else, something more tangible. Emma grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We have to fight it together." She was right. The shadow, that horrible force, had fed off our fear, our isolation. But now, with the three of us together, with our will to survive stronger than the darkness, I could feel it begin to weaken. The grip it had on us was loosening, like a noose slipping off. The room seemed to breathe with us, the walls shifting and creaking as though they too were trying to understand what was happening. We were no longer the frightened family from just moments ago. The power of this house, this malevolent force, was no match for our unity. "We need to stay strong," I said, my voice clearer now, more determined. "We're not going to let it tear us apart. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't have power over us anymore." Henry looked up at me, his face pale but now filled with recognition. "Dad, I'm scared. What's happening?" I held him close, pressing him to my chest. "I know, son. I know. But we have to stay together. We're not alone in this." Emma stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "We're a family, and we're going to make it through this. Together." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt a surge of strength. The shadow recoiled, as if it were being pushed back by the sheer force of our unity. The flickering lights dimmed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. I glanced around the room. The shadows were no longer swirling around us. The temperature had returned to normal, the oppressive cold that had filled the house lifting just enough for us to breathe freely. But the house still felt wrong. The air was still thick with a presence, something dark and hungry, but it wasn't as overpowering as before. We had faced it down, together, and that had made all the difference. "We can leave," I said, my voice steady now, though it was a whisper. "Let's go." But as we turned toward the door, something deep in the house groaned. The floor beneath our feet rumbled, and the walls seemed to shift, warping and twisting as though the house itself was trying to fight back. The darkness hadn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the corners, waiting for the moment when our resolve would weaken. But we were not giving up. Not anymore. We moved toward the door, taking slow, cautious steps. As we reached the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, its empty eyes following our every move. The shadow was not gone, it was simply biding its time, waiting for another moment of weakness. But this time, we would not let it win. I could feel Emma's hand in mine, warm and firm. I looked down at Henry, his eyes wide, but filled with hope now, not terror. And as we crossed the threshold, leaving the house behind us, I knew one thing for certain. The battle was not over. But we had won this round. And we would never stop fighting. Not for each other. Not for our family. As we stepped out into the night, the house behind us seemed to settle, the darkness still lingering in the windows, watching us leave. We would never forget what we had endured. But the shadows, for now, were silent. And that was enough. The road ahead was uncertain. The terror had not ended. But we had each other. And together, we could face anything. We ran from the house, our feet slipping on the wet ground, as if trying to outrun some invisible enemy chasing us. The air around us was cold, but not as sharp as it had been inside the house. Each step echoed in the silence until we were finally far enough from that dark entity. "We made it," I said, breathing a sigh of relief, but a deep unease settled in my chest, keeping me from feeling completely free. Henry walked beside us, but something was off. His movements seemed strange. His gaze was vacant, like he was in a trance, and his hands were not the same. I tried to get his attention, calling out to him. "Henry, are you okay?" I said, stepping closer, my heart beating faster. It seemed like he didn't hear me. His eyes were glazed over, but sometimes I noticed them flicking back to the house, as if pulled by some invisible force, like a magnet to the darkness inside. "Henry?" I called again, now gripping his shoulders. "Look at me." He turned, but not fully to me. His gaze was distant, as if he was looking through me. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen before, fear, but not the kind we'd felt in the house. This was something different, something invisible. "Dad. My friend," he said. His voice was soft and muddled, like he wasn't talking to me, but to someone who wasn't there. "I know, son," I said, trying to comfort him, but the fear was creeping in again. "We're far from that place now. Everything is going to be okay." But something about him was different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but he no longer seemed like the Henry the first knew. He wasn't laughing, wasn't playing like he usually did. He was just walking beside us, silent, sometimes stopping to look back at the house, as though hypnotized. "Maybe we should find help?" Emma said, her voice trembling with worry. I could tell she felt it too, the unease that was settling in. I nodded, trying to hide my own growing fear. "Yes, we need to get Henry checked out. He's not himself." Even as we walked away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. Henry, this little boy, was no longer fully himself. Part of him, some piece of him, still lingered inside that house, under the influence of something sinister. He wasn't entirely here. We walked farther away from that place, but I could still feel that dark presence clinging to us. Henry remained changed, and I had no idea how deep this effect ran. Every time I looked at him, I could see that look in his eyes, the same fear I had seen when we first tried to escape, but it was different now, colder. "We didn't just escape the house," I said, glancing at Emma. She didn't reply, but squeezed my hand tighter. I was sure of it. Though we had left the house, its influence had not left us. Henry was different, and I couldn't tell just how much of him had been taken by what lived there. He was still our son, but his eyes held something else now, something distant. And I knew whatever we had escaped from in that house was not truly gone. The trap had not been broken. It had simply followed us. That night, we found refuge in a small hotel on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. The room was simple, but for the first time in what felt like ages, it was quiet. No sounds of objects moving on their own, no footsteps creeping through the halls. The air was calm, and the eerie sense of being watched seemed to vanish with the thick walls of the hotel surrounding us. Emma and I settled into bed, our nerves still on edge, but we tried to comfort ourselves with the thought that we had finally escaped. The thought of Henry being free from that dark influence gave me a fleeting sense of peace. Henry was in a bed next to us, tucked in tightly under the covers, but his restless sleep told me otherwise. I could hear him tossing and turning, mumbling faintly in his sleep. It wasn't the typical dream talk of a child, though. This sounded different, unsettling. "He's gone," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "The house, it's over." I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. The feeling of being followed, of something still lingering, didn't leave me. I had to believe that we'd gotten away, but the doubt gnawed at me. And then it happened. "He's still here." Henry's voice broke through the silence, sharp and clear, though it had an eerie quality. He was sitting up now, his small form outlined against the dim light of the bedside lamp. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about, Henry?" I asked gently, though the words stuck in my throat. He didn't look at me. His eyes were glazed over, as though seeing something I couldn't. "My friend," he said, his voice soft but filled with a strange, detached tone. "He followed us. He's still here." Emma sat up, her breath catching in her throat. "Henry, honey, what do you mean?" "There's no one here." But Henry's gaze shifted beyond us, toward the window, where the faint moonlight filtered through the curtains. "He says we can't leave," Henry continued, his voice growing quieter, almost too quiet, like he was listening to someone else speak through him. "He says I have to stay." I got up, my chest tightening with fear. "Henry, who are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He's here," Henry whispered again, pointing towards the door, his finger trembling slightly. "He's always here." I turned to Emma, my eyes wide with alarm. This wasn't just a boy we knew. This was something else, something not fully human, something that still had its grip on him. I could feel the weight of it, the presence, the invisible hand that reached from the shadows, not letting go. "We have to get out of here," I muttered, my voice hoarse. "This place isn't safe. We're not safe." But it was too late. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with a coldness I couldn't explain. And despite the quietness, I could hear it, a faint sound, a low whisper, just beyond my hearing. Something from the dark, something that had followed us. "Please." Henry's voice broke through again, and I turned back to him. His face was pale, and his eyes looked almost pleading. "He won't let me go." I grabbed Henry and pulled him into my arms, holding him tight as if trying to keep whatever was out there at bay. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever we had left behind in that house, it had followed us. And now, it was here. And Henry? Henry wasn't himself anymore. I kissed his forehead, whispering, "We're here. You're safe now." But I wasn't sure I could believe those words anymore. The darkness had found us again. The days that followed were nothing like I had hoped. Despite the promise of safety when we left the house, it felt as though we were still caught in its grip. The feeling of being watched, of something dark lingering at the edges of our lives, grew more oppressive with each passing hour. Desperation set in. We had to do something. Anything. I started searching frantically, books, websites, old records, looking for any information that could explain what was happening to us. I even reached out to local religious figures and spiritualists, hoping for an answer. But nothing seemed to help. Emma and I sat together one evening, our minds clouded with fear, trying to piece together a way out. "There has to be something," I said, flipping through an ancient-looking book I'd found in a small local bookstore. Some ritual, some cleansing now will work. But the more I read, the more hopeless I felt. Every attempt to rid our lives of this presence seemed futile. The words in the books all spoke of rituals, old ones, forgotten ones, but none of them promised any real solution. They were mere theories, based on centuries-old folklore, stories of spiritual battles that seemed like nothing more than myths. Emma looked up from her own stack of papers. Maybe we need to contact someone professional, someone who really knows what they're doing. But my mind raced. We had already done that several times. The paranormal specialist had fled in terror. Everyone we'd spoken to had warned us the same thing. Sometimes there's no escaping it. Still, we tried. We even contacted a medium who claimed to have experience with such things. She arrived late one evening, bringing with her candles and strange, cryptic words of protection. She said she could see it, sense the energy that had latched onto Henry, and that we could drive it out. We sat together in the dimly lit room, the medium's words heavy with fear, as she instructed us to stay calm. "Focus," she said. "Focus on the light. Let it fill you. Let it drive out the darkness." But as she spoke the incantation, I felt it. The room grew colder, darker. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room. A shadow, fleeting but there. Emma gripped my hand so tightly that I winced. The medium's voice wavered. "Stay with me," she urged. "Focus on the energy, banish it. You must believe it can work." But the more we tried, the more the pressure increased. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, curling and twisting like dark vines. The temperature dropped even lower. I looked at Henry, whose eyes had glazed over once again, staring at something I couldn't see. And then, the unmistakable sound echoed through the room, whispering voices, like a chorus of tortured souls, faint but growing louder. The air became thick with malevolent energy, and in that moment, I knew whatever was with us wasn't going anywhere. "Stop it. Stop!" I shouted, standing up, unable to bear the growing darkness any longer. The medium staggered back, her face pale, eyes wide in shock. It's too powerful. It's not leaving. Nothing can stop it." In that instant, the room exploded with a violent gust of wind, knocking everything over. The candles flickered out, and the whispers grew into chilling, unintelligible screams. I grabbed Henry, pulling him to me, desperate to shield him from whatever force was now inside our lives, but it was useless. The power in that room was something beyond our understanding. Emma was crying, her voice shaking. "What do we do now? We've tried everything." I didn't have an answer. We had tried everything I could think of. And still, we were trapped. The medium turned and fled, leaving us in the cold silence of the room, still filled with that oppressive weight. Henry, still distant, still not himself, whispered once more, "He's here. He won't let me go." The air felt suffocating, and the room seemed to close in around us. I wanted to run, to escape, but where could we go? We had left the house, but whatever haunted us had followed, and no ritual, no prayer, no cleansing seemed to work. It was clear now. We were fighting a losing battle. And no matter where we went, no matter what we did, we would never truly escape the darkness. The days after the failed ritual were a blur. The sense of dread that had once been a creeping feeling was now an overwhelming presence, settling over us like a suffocating blanket. We tried to maintain some semblance of normality, but every moment felt charged with something dark, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing in from all sides. And then came the night when things took an even darker turn. It happened after dinner, just as the sun had set and the hotel was quiet. We had been trying to keep Henry occupied, trying to give him some sense of peace, but the more we ignored it, the more obvious it became he was no longer the boy he had been. He had always been a curious child, full of energy, but now he seemed to withdraw into himself more and more. His eyes, once filled with wonder, were distant, hollow. And that night, as we sat in the small living area of our hotel room, he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in days. "Dad," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I want to go home." I froze. I had been avoiding the idea of going back to that house. I thought, hoped, we were done with it. But Henry's eyes, those eyes that once held such innocence, were now filled with something else. Something darker. "Henry," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we can't go back there. You remember what happened. The house isn't safe. You know that, don't you?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze unfocused, as though he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. And then, in a voice that sounded far too old for his age, he spoke again. "He says I have to come back. He wants me to bring him home." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who, Henry? Who wants you to bring them home?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked at me, his expression oddly serene, but his eyes were full of a deep, unsettling sadness. "My friend. He wants to come back with me. He says he'll make it better. He says I won't be alone if I bring him." Emma gasped, her face paling. She had been sitting quietly, watching Henry with a growing sense of fear, but now she stood up quickly, almost knocking over the chair behind her. "No," she said, her voice sharp, her hand shaking as she reached out for Henry. "You can't go back there. You can't." But Henry pulled away from her, his expression hardening, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I have to. He told me. He says it will be better if I bring him back." My stomach twisted with dread. This wasn't my son anymore. This wasn't the boy who used to play with his toys, who used to laugh and run around the house. This was something else, something that had taken hold of him, twisted his mind. I could feel the weight of it. This friend, this shadow, had taken root inside Henry, and it wasn't going to let go. Emma's voice broke through the growing panic. "We can't let him go back. We have to stop this." "But how? How could we stop something like this when nothing we did had worked? We had already tried everything we could think of, and still, Henry wasn't the same. The house was still in his mind, still calling to him. "Henry, listen to me," I said, stepping closer to him, my voice shaking with urgency. "You can't go back there. That place, it's not your friend. It's something dark. It's not him. Whatever you're hearing, whatever you're feeling, none of it's real. You have to trust me." But Henry's gaze was distant again, his eyes staring at something over my shoulder. His voice came in a whisper. "He says you don't understand. He says you're lying." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for him. "Henry, please. We're going to get through this. We're going to make sure you're safe. Just stay with us. Stay with your mom and me." But it was too late. His gaze was fixed now, no longer looking at me. His face softened, as though he was hearing something only he could understand. "He's waiting. I have to bring him back," he muttered, almost in a trance. I could see the darkness in his eyes now, the hollow space where my son used to be. Whatever was inside him, whatever had followed us, was still there, pulling him towards something worse. Emma stepped forward, trying to pull Henry into her arms, but he stepped back, his body rigid, his eyes now wide with a kind of strange determination. "I have to go. I have to take him with me." I felt a wave of cold panic sweep over me. This was more than I could handle. "No!" I shouted, reaching for him again. "Henry, we're not going back. Whatever's in that house, whatever's following us, we're not going back." But his resistance was growing stronger, and his gaze was becoming more distant, as if he was no longer hearing me. The room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of something dark, something watching. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on us. "He's waiting for me," Henry said again, his voice calm and eerily serene. "He wants to come home." And in that moment, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever force had taken hold of Henry was far from over. It had followed us, had embedded itself into our lives, and now it had claimed him completely. Whatever this friend was, it had no intention of letting us go. And I feared that the only way to stop it was to return to where it all began. I stood there in the dim light of the hotel room, my heart racing as I watched Henry, my son, slip further away from us. His words echoed in my mind, repeating the same chilling refrain, "He's waiting for me. I have to bring him back." The more I tried to hold on to him, to reach the boy I knew was still buried inside, the more distant he became. His eyes were cold, empty, a shadow of the child I had once known. I wanted to scream, to fight back against whatever invisible force was tightening its grip on him, but I knew deep down that none of it would work. Nothing we had done so far had worked. We had tried everything. We had tried to run, to hide, but it was all in vain. "Emma," I whispered, turning to her. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she looked at our son, the fear and helplessness in her eyes almost more than I could bear. "We can't keep running. We can't escape this." Her gaze was desperate, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "We can't go back. We can't go anywhere near that house. It's not safe." I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts. The weight of everything pressing down on me was suffocating. It wasn't just the house, it was the place itself, the energy that had clung to us since the moment we stepped inside. The house was the source of all of this, the poltergeist, the shadows, the voices, the terror that had been slowly devouring us. And it had followed us here, to this hotel, to wherever we tried to hide. But there was something even more terrifying now. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the only way to stop this, to save my son, was to leave everything behind. We had to leave Salt Lake City. We had to leave it all behind before whatever was in that house completely consumed us. "Emma," I said, my voice shaking, "the house, it's not just a house. It's the source. It's the place that brought this thing into our lives. And it won't stop until it has us all. Henry, me, you. It's not done. It's just begun." Her eyes widened with fear, understanding finally dawning in her face. "You think it's the house?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You think it's not just the spirit, but the house itself?" I nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on Henry. He was still standing there, completely unaware of our conversation, as if he were in some trance. "Yes," I said softly. "The house is what's feeding it. We have to leave Salt Lake. We have to leave this whole city behind." The thought of going back, of stepping foot inside that house again, made my stomach churn. But if we didn't, if we stayed even one more night, I knew the consequences would be far worse than we could ever imagine. "Henry," I said, my voice steady but full of sorrow, "we can't go back there. You have to come with us, son. We're leaving this city, we're leaving everything behind, and we're never coming back. Do you understand?" He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, looking past me, his eyes distant. And then, slowly, almost mechanically, he nodded. "I understand, Dad. I have to leave him behind too." I swallowed hard, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. Maybe, just maybe, we could escape. Maybe this would end. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I knew the truth. The house wasn't just a house. It was a wound, a tear in the fabric of reality, and if we didn't leave now, truly leave, we would be forever marked by it. It would follow us wherever we went. It would haunt us until there was nothing left of us but shadows. I turned to Emma, my resolve hardening. "We're going. Right now. Pack whatever we need, and we're leaving this city. We have to go before it's too late." As we began to gather our things in a rush, the air in the room grew thick. I could feel it again, that presence, the one that had been with us from the very beginning. I could feel it creeping closer, getting ready to strike. But we couldn't stay. We couldn't give in. We had to escape. And no matter what, we couldn't look back. With one final glance at Henry, who was silently standing in the corner, my heart heavy with both dread and hope, I turned to leave the room. We had made our decision. We had to go. And we couldn't stop until we were far, far away from that cursed place. We stood in front of the house once more. The sun was setting, casting a haunting, orange glow over the old structure, making the peeling paint and cracked windows seem even more ominous. For days, I had told myself we could never return here, that this place, this cursed house, was no longer part of our lives. But here we were, standing on its doorstep, preparing to face the last remnants of the nightmare. We hadn't spoken much during the drive here. Henry had remained eerily silent, his face pale and expressionless, while Emma and I exchanged glances, both of us trying to convince ourselves that this would be the last time we would ever step foot in that house. "We're just here to get our things," Emma said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. It was as if she, too, was trying to make the finality of it real, trying to grasp onto some semblance of control. "After this, we leave. For good." I nodded, but my stomach churned with unease. There was something wrong, something I couldn't explain. I kept telling myself that once we left, once we were away from Salt Lake City, it would all end. But standing here, staring at the house, a gnawing feeling clawed at me. "We'll be quick," I said, trying to reassure her, though my voice was tight with doubt. I glanced over at Henry, who still hadn't spoken, his eyes locked onto the house like he was drawn to it, unable to tear himself away. We stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as it swung open, almost as though it were welcoming us back. The air felt thick, heavy with the memories and the energy that had plagued us for so long. The smell of dust and rot filled my nose, but there was something else, a sense of anticipation, as if the house itself knew we were here for the last time. As we moved through the dark, silent rooms, the weight of what we were doing pressed heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, that the house was watching us, planning its next move. "Let's just grab everything and go," I said, my voice strained. "We don't need to stay any longer than necessary." But as we began gathering the few belongings we had left, strange things started to happen. A picture frame on the mantel shifted, its edge scraping across the wood, as if someone or something had nudged it. A cold breeze swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The air felt colder now, almost as if the house itself was alive, feeding off our presence, waiting for us to make a mistake. And then we heard it. A low whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then it grew louder, faint voices, distant and angry, echoing through the house. My heart stopped. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling as she glanced nervously around. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just random sounds, they were words. Angry words filled with malice. I stepped back, feeling the room close in around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the temperature dropping rapidly. And then I saw it. A shadow moving across the wall. At first, it was just a flicker, a blur at the edge of my vision. But then it solidified, stretching across the floor in front of me, like a figure emerging from the darkness. I froze, my eyes locked on the shape as it grew clearer. The figure wasn't human. It was tall, its limbs elongated, its form twisted and unnatural. Its face was a void, a mask of emptiness, hollow and cold. And it was staring at me. "Henry!" I shouted, spinning around to find my son. But he was gone. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls shaking, as if the house itself was alive, reacting to our presence. The shadow lurched forward, its movement jerky and unnatural, and then I heard a scream, Henry's scream. I ran toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma was right behind me, her face as pale as mine, fear etched into every line of her face. We reached Henry's room, and I froze in the doorway. There, standing at the center of the room, was my son, his back to us, staring at the wall. But he wasn't alone. The shadow was there, too. It was reaching for him, wrapping around him, pulling him closer. "Henry!" I screamed, but it was too late. The figure turned, its face now visible, a grotesque, distorted version of the man I had seen in the photographs, the one who had once lived here, the one who had died in this house. Henry didn't move. He didn't even flinch. The figure reached out, and then, with one final scream, it pulled Henry into the darkness, vanishing into the air, leaving only an empty room behind. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of what had just happened crashing over me. Emma's scream echoed in my ears as she rushed to Henry's side, but he was gone. He was no longer there. The house was silent. I didn't know if we could leave now, whether we could ever escape this place. I had come back to face the past, but it seemed that the past had come back to claim us. And as the shadow faded into the walls, the house itself seemed to breathe again, alive with its thirst for more. We had made a mistake coming back. And now we would never leave. The house had fallen silent. No whispers. No creaking of the floorboards. No eerie shadows dancing along the walls. It was as if the entire house had held its breath, waiting for something, waiting for us. The oppressive stillness pressed down on my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of it. Emma stood beside me, her face pale and rigid, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't moved either. We both knew what had just happened. Our son, our precious Henry, had been taken. Taken by the very thing that had tormented us for weeks. And now the house seemed to be waiting for the next step, for the next victim, for the final act to unfold. I glanced at the empty room. The walls seemed to stretch and shift in the dim light, like they were alive, twisting and bending to some invisible force. The air was thick with cold, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. Every inch of the house felt wrong, unnatural. It was as though the house itself had become a monster, devouring everything in its path. Then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I heard it. A low, guttural growl. Almost like a murmur. Like the house itself was speaking to us, taunting us, telling us that it was far from finished. "Where is he?" Emma's voice cracked as she whispered the question I knew we were both asking. Her eyes flickered toward the doorway, toward the dark hallway that led further into the house, but neither of us could bring ourselves to move. I tried to speak, to give her an answer, any answer, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell her that we had failed, that Henry was gone? I could feel it then, something watching us. Something waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room began to grow longer, more defined. They seemed to pulse, to writhe, as if the darkness itself were alive, reaching for us. I looked away, unable to bear the sight of them, but it was no use. They were everywhere. I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady myself. We had to leave. We had to get out of this house before it consumed us, too. But every instinct told me that the house wasn't done with us yet. It had taken Henry, and now it was waiting for us to make the next move. Emma, my voice was barely a whisper, but she heard me. Her eyes locked with mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw the same fear reflected in her gaze that I felt in my own heart. But even in the depths of that fear, there was something else, something darker. A knowing. We both knew that running wouldn't help us. The house would follow us, no matter where we went. I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth aloud, but I could see it in her eyes. The realization was dawning on both of us, as terrifying as it was. This house, this place, was never going to let us leave. The silence deepened. The shadows stretched further, encroaching upon us, filling every corner of the room. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind us, as if the house had locked us in for good. We weren't just trapped in the house anymore. We were trapped in its story, caught in its grasp, unable to escape. And somewhere in the distance, a soft, mocking laugh echoed through the halls. It wasn't Henry's laugh. It wasn't Emma's or mine. It was something else entirely. Something far older. And far hungrier. I knew then, in the pit of my stomach, that the house hadn't just taken Henry, it had taken all of us. And now, it was time for us to become part of its twisted history. The air grew heavier, thicker, suffocating as the silence persisted. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shifting shadow, a flicker in the periphery. But it wasn't like the others. This one felt different. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare to breathe, didn't dare to move. Emma must have sensed it too, for she turned toward me, her face pale, her eyes wide with the same terror that I felt. "Do you see that?" Her voice trembled. I nodded, unable to speak. The shadow in the corner of the room wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was growing, shifting, forming something solid. Something small. It was a child. At first, it seemed like a mere distortion of light and dark, a trick of the eye, but the more I stared, the more it took shape. A small, slender figure, crouching at the edge of the room, watching us with eyes that were darker than the night. It had the distinct appearance of a child, thin arms, ragged clothes that seemed to hang off its body like something from another time. And as it stepped forward, its features became clearer, more defined. It was Henry. But it wasn't. The child's face was a twisted version of our son's, distorted and warped as though it had been carved from the darkness itself. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light, and his mouth stretched into a grin that sent chills down my spine. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. But the resemblance was undeniable. The same tousled hair, the same small, fragile frame. The same stance, hunched and unnatural, as though it were caught between worlds. I reached out, instinctively, as if to call out to Henry, to break through to whatever had taken him. "Henry? Is that you?" My voice was shaky, hoarse, barely a whisper, but I didn't care. I had to know. But the child did not respond. Instead, it tilted its head to the side, as though considering me, studying me with an expression that was both familiar and wrong. Its mouth stretched wider, revealing teeth that were far too sharp for a child, teeth that gleamed in the dim light like the edges of broken glass. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as though every inch of the house had closed in around us. I wanted to turn away, to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. Emma clung to me, her fingers digging into my arm as she whispered, "That's not him. That's not Henry." I wanted to argue, to convince her that it had to be our son, but deep down, I knew she was right. This thing before us was no longer Henry. This was something else, something twisted and hungry, a fragment of whatever dark force had taken root in this house. The child's gaze never left me, its hollow eyes boring into my soul. It took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it didn't belong in this world. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it froze, its body stiffening in place. I felt it then, the pull. A force, invisibly yet palpable, pulling at my very core, like it was trying to drag me toward the child. Like it wanted me to join it, to become part of whatever this thing was. I took a step back, instinctively pulling Emma with me, but the child's presence seemed to grow stronger, suffocating. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and for a split second, I thought I could hear whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs, coming from the child. "Stay away from it," Emma gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heartbeat. I didn't need to be told twice. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to get away, but the house wouldn't let us leave. The shadow of the child stretched across the room, and I realized, too late, that it wasn't just the child that was watching us now. It was the house. It had always been the house. And now, it wanted us to join its twisted collection. I watched in frozen horror as Henry, my son, took a slow, deliberate step toward the child-shaped shadow. His movements were unnatural, slow, like he was walking through water, yet he never hesitated. It was as if something else entirely was guiding him. "Henry!" I screamed, my voice thick with panic, but he didn't respond. His eyes were empty, his face blank, as though his soul had been stripped away, leaving only the shell behind. He continued forward, his small feet dragging across the floor as the shadow stretched out its arms to him. It was no longer the distorted figure of a child. It had morphed, taken on an even more terrible shape, one that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't comprehend. It was as though the very air around it bent and twisted, and I could feel the weight of something ancient, something terrible, pressing in from all sides. "Henry!" I shouted again, but the sound of my own voice seemed far away, muffled by the crushing silence that had fallen over the house. The moment Henry reached the shadow, it engulfed him. The child thing opened its arms, and Henry, still like a puppet on invisible strings, stepped right into its embrace. The shadow didn't hesitate. It wrapped around him, its form expanding, swallowing him whole. I staggered forward, heart hammering in my chest, as if I could somehow break the bond between them, but I was too late. The moment Henry was within its grasp, he went still. His body, once filled with life, was now limp, an empty vessel. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone. My arms were heavy, as if the shadow itself had wrapped around them too, holding me in place. The room around me began to distort, the walls bending like rubber, the floor twisting beneath my feet. It felt like the very fabric of reality was warping, like the house itself was alive and pulling at my soul. The child's face, if you could still call it a face, shifted, becoming more grotesque by the second. It grinned, a wide, unnatural smile stretching across its face, showing jagged, broken teeth. And through that smile, I could see the reflection of something darker, something far older and far more sinister than I had ever imagined. Henry didn't struggle. He didn't cry out for help. He simply stood there, trapped in the shadow's grip, his eyes glazed over as if all the life had been drained out of him. The shadow's grip tightened, and I could see Henry's form becoming more transparent, more ghostly. He was vanishing before my eyes, as if he were being absorbed into the dark thing before me. It was like watching a dream slip away, like watching your child fade into nothingness. I tried to move, tried to tear my gaze away from the horrifying sight, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, forced to witness this nightmare unfold. The shadow's grip around Henry loosened slightly, as if it had decided it had taken enough. But instead of fading away, it stayed, lingering in the air, feeding off the fear that had taken root in my heart. And then, in a voice so cold it chilled me to my very bones, I heard it. "You cannot save him." The words came from nowhere, echoing around the room, filling every corner with the same hollow, empty tone. It wasn't Henry speaking, nor was it the shadow child. It was the house itself, the malevolent force that had been watching us all this time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rush forward and pull Henry from the shadow's grasp, but something stopped me, something far darker than fear. It was the realization that there was no escaping this. There was no saving him. Not now. Henry had already slipped beyond the point of no return. As the shadow fully enveloped him, I felt the last vestiges of his presence vanish, as if the boy I had known and loved was being swallowed whole by the darkness. And in that moment, I knew the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had claimed its next victim. I stood there, helpless, as the thing that had once been my son disappeared into the darkness, and the house continued to pulse with its terrible, unseen hunger. The last breath I drew in that house was not my own. It was the house's. The house was silent again, but this silence felt different. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, nor was it the unsettling stillness that had followed each of the terrifying events. This silence was final. The air was thick with the weight of something unspeakable. I stumbled back, away from the place where Henry had once stood. My chest tightened, and I felt as though I could no longer breathe. My eyes darted to where the shadow had been, but it was gone. It had claimed him. I couldn't deny it anymore. I reached out, my hand trembling, and found Emma's, pulling her toward me as if her touch could somehow bring me back to the world I had once known. We had to leave. I had to get her out of here. But even as I turned toward the door, I felt something strange, something cold, creeping up my spine. We hurried out of the house, the weight of what had happened pulling at my every step. The night air was a relief, but even as we stepped away from the threshold of that cursed house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really leaving. That somehow, no matter how far we went, it would follow us. I looked to Emma, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. We need to go somewhere far. We need to forget. We need to. I didn't even know what I was saying anymore. I was lost. Emma nodded, her voice barely a whisper. We'll leave. We'll make sure this is all behind us. But as we walked toward the car, I heard a voice, a faint, chilling sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. Daddy. My heart stopped. I turned sharply, my pulse racing as I scanned the darkness around us, but the street was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing except the shadows cast by the streetlights. And yet, I could feel it. The presence was there. Henry? I called out, my voice cracking, but it wasn't my son who answered. It was something else, something that had never truly left him. The door to the car slammed shut behind me, but even as I climbed inside, a cold chill filled the back seat. I felt it more than heard it, the whisper that followed us as we drove away, a quiet echo that would forever haunt my every moment. We couldn't escape. Not really. Henry, or what had become of him, was no longer the child I had known. I could see it in his eyes now, the emptiness, the void where his soul had once been. He had been taken, yes, but something had returned in his place. I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there, but the seat was empty. Still, I felt him. The silence was unbearable, and the longer I sat there, the more I realized that we had all been marked. We had never truly left the house. It had followed us, woven itself into the very fabric of our existence. And the worst part was that I knew, deep down, that we could never go back to the life we had. Not after what had happened. Not after what Henry had become. He wasn't just lost to the spirit that had haunted that house. No, he had become the vessel. The new home. The poltergeist had found its anchor. Its final resting place. As we drove further from Salt Lake City, I glanced over at Emma, her eyes vacant, as if she too could feel the weight of what had changed. Her lips parted, and for the briefest moment, I thought she might speak, but the words never came. There was no escaping this. There would be no peaceful life for us, no matter how far we went. We would forever carry the house with us. And Henry? He would never be truly gone. The house had claimed him, and in doing so, it had claimed all of us. Forever bound to its darkness. Forever entwined in a nightmare that we would never wake from. And that was the last truth I understood. The poltergeist had not simply haunted our home. It had found a new one. It was in Henry. And it would stay there. Forever. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.